Hans Christian Andersen, and this is called The Buckwheat. Very often, after a violent thunderstorm, a field of buckwheat appears blackened and singed, as if a flame of fire had passed over it. The country people say that this appearance is caused by lightning, but I will tell you what the sparrow says. And the sparrow heard it from an old willow tree which grew near a field of buckwheat, and is there still. It is a large, venerable tree, though a little crippled by age. The trunk has been split, and out of the crevice grass and brambles grow. The tree bends forward slightly. The branches hang quite down to the ground, just like the green air. Corn grows in the surrounding fields, not only rye and barley, but oats. Pretty oats that, when ripe, look like a number of little golden canary birds sitting on a bough. The corn has a smiling look and the heaviest and richest ears behind their heads, low as if in pious humility. Once there was also a field of buckwheat. This field was exactly opposite to the old willow. The buckwheat did not bend like the other grain, but erected its head proudly and stiffly on the stem. I am as valuable as any other corn, said he, and I am much handsomer. My flowers are beautiful as the bloom of the apple blossom, and it is a pleasure to look at us. Do you know of anything prettier than we are, you old willow tree? The willow tree nodded his head, as if he would say, Indeed I do. But the buckwheat spread itself out with pride and said, Stupid tree, he is so old that grass grows out of his body. There arose a very terrible storm. All the field flowers folded their leaves together or bowed their little heads while the storm passed over them. But the buckwheat stood erect in its pride. Bend your head as we do, said the flowers. I have no occasion to do so, replied the buckwheat. Bend your head as we do, cried the ears of corn. The angel of the storm is coming. His wings spread from the sky above to the earth beneath. It will strike you down before you can cry for mercy. But I will not bend my head, said the buckwheat. Close your flowers and bend your leaves, said the old willow tree. Do not look at the lightning when the cloud bursts. Even men cannot do that. In a flash of lightning, heaven opens, and we can look in, but the sight will strike even human beings blind. What then must happen to us, who only grow out of the earth, are so inferior to them, if we venture to do so? Inferior indeed, said the buckwheat. Now I intend to have a peep into heaven. Proudly and boldly he looked up, while the lightning flashed across the sky as if the whole world were in flames. When the dreadful storm had passed, the flowers and the corn raised their drooping heads in the pure still air, refreshed by the rain. But the buckwheat lay like a weed in the field, burnt to blackness by the lightning. The branches of the old willow tree rustled in the wind, and large water drops fell from the green leaves, as if the old willow were weeping. Then the sparrows asked why he was weeping, when all around him seemed so cheerful. See, they said, how the sun shines, and the clouds float in the blue sky. Do you not smell the sweet perfume from flower and bush? Wherefore do you weep, old willow tree? Then the willow told them of the haughty pride of the buckwheat, and of the punishment which followed in consequence. This is a story told to me by the sparrows one evening, when I begged them to relate some tale to me. The end. And that is the fairy tale of the buckwheat, and why it does seem to be struck by lightning whenever there's a storm, because it is too proud to bow its head to the storm angel as the storm angel passes by. Thank you for listening, and many blessings. Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. The next fairy tale is called The Butterfly. There was once a butterfly who wished for a bride, and, as may be supposed, he wanted to choose a very pretty one from among the flowers. He glanced with a very critical eye at all the flower beds, and found that the flowers were seated quietly and demurely on their stalks, just as maidens should sit before they are engaged. But there was a great number of them, and it appeared as if his search would become very wearisome. The butterfly did not like to take too much trouble, so he flew off on a visit to the daisies. The French call this flower Marguerite, and they say that a little daisy can prophesy. Lovers pluck off the leaves, and they pluck each leaf. They ask a question about their lovers, thus, does he love me or not? Ardently distracted, very much, a little, not at all, and so on. Everyone speaks these words in his own language. The butterfly came to the Marguerite to inquire, but he did not pluck off her leaves. He pressed a kiss on each of them, for he thought they were always more to be done by kindness. Darling Marguerite Daisy, he said to her, you're the wisest woman of all flowers. Pray tell me which of the flowers I shall choose for my wife, which will be my bride. When I know, I will fly directly to her and propose. But Marguerite did not answer him. She was offended that he should call her a woman when she was only a girl, and there is a great difference. He asked her a second time and then a third, but she remained dumb, and answered not a word. Then he would wait no longer, but flew away to commence his wooing at once. It was in the early spring, when the crocus and the snowdrop were in full bloom. They are very pretty, thought the butterfly. Charming little lasses, but they are rather formal. Then, as young lads often do, he looked out for the elder girls. He next flew to the anemones, and they were rather sour to his taste. The violet, a little too sentimental. The lime blossoms too small, and besides, there was a large family of them. The apple blossoms, though, they looked like roses bloomed today, but might fall off tomorrow with the first wind that blew, and he thought that a marriage with one of them might last too short a time. The pea blossom pleased him most of all. He was appeased by it, he was pleased by it, and he liked it. She was white, she was graceful, red, slender, and belonged to those domestic maidens who have pretty appearance, and can get to be useful in the kitchen. He was just about to make her an offer when, close by the maiden, he saw a pod with a withered flower hanging at the end. Who is that? He asked. That is my sister, replied the pea blossom. Oh, indeed. And you will like her some day, said he, and he flew away directly, for he felt quite shocked. A honeysuckle hung far from the hedge in full bloom, but there were so many girls like her with long faces and sallow complexions. No, he did not like her. But which one did he like? Spring went by, summer drew towards its close, autumn came, but he had not decided. The flowers now appeared in the most gorgeous robes, but all in vain. They had but not the fresh, fragrant air of youth, for the heart asked for fragrance, even when it no longer young, and there is very little of that to be found in the dahlias or the dry chrysanthemums. Therefore the butterfly turned to the mint on the ground. You know, this plant has no blossom, but it is sweetness all over, full of fragrance from head to foot, with the scent of a flower in every leaf. I will take her, said the butterfly. So he made her an offer, but the mint stood silent and stiff, as she listened to him. At last she said, friendship, if you please, nothing more. I am old, you are old, but we may live for each other just the same. As to marrying, no. Don't let us appear ridiculous at our age. And so it happened that the butterfly got no wife at all. He had been too long choosing, which is always a bad plan, and the butterfly became what is known as an old bachelor. It was late in autumn, with rainy and cloudy weather. The cold wind blew over the bowed backs of the willows, so that they creaked again. It was not the weather for flying about in summer clothes, but fortunately, the butterfly was not out in it. He had got a shelter by chance. It was in a room heated by a stove, as warm as the summer. He could exist here, he said, well enough. But it is not enough merely to exist, said he. I need freedom, sunshine, a little flower for a companion. Then he flew again to the window pane and was seen and admired by those in the room, who caught him, stuck him on a pin in a box of curiosities. They could do no more for him. Now I am perched on a stalk like the flowers, said the butterfly. It is not very pleasant, certainly. I should imagine it is something like being married, for here I am stuck fast. And with this thought, he consoled himself a little. That seems very poor consolation, said one of the plants in the room. That grew in a pot. Ah, thought the butterfly, one can't very well trust these plants in pots. They have too much to do with mankind. The end. And that is the tale of the butterfly. You know, there is a bigger lesson in that, much to be learnt, and a bigger story to it. But I'm curious to see who knows and who wants to try and explain what the real meaning and the real lesson behind that is, because there is one. Thank you for listening and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Wysteria here, and the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. This one's called The Drop of Water. Of course you know what is meant by a magnifying glass. One of those round spectacle glasses that makes everything look 100 times bigger than it is. When anyone takes one of these and holds it to his eye and looks at a drop of water from the pond yonder, he sees above 1,000 wonderful creatures that are otherwise never discerned in the water. But there they are, and it is no delusion. It almost looks like a great plate full of spiders jumping about in a crowd. And how fierce they are! They tear off each other's legs and arms and bodies, before and behind, and yet they are merry and joyful in their way. And now, there once was an old man whom all the people called Cribble Crabble, for that was his name. He always wanted the best of everything, and when he could not manage it otherwise, he did it by magic. There he sat one day and held his magnifying glass to his eye and looked at a drop of water that had been taken out of a puddle by the ditch. But what cribbling and crabbling was there? All the thousands of little creatures hopped and sprang and tugged at one another and ate each other up. That is horrible, said old Cribble Crabble. Can one not persuade them to live in peace and quietness, so that each one may mind his own business? And he thought it over and over, but it would not do. And so he had recourse to magic. I must give them colour, that they may be seen more plainly, said he. And he poured something like a little drop of red wine into the drop of water, but it was witch's blood from the lobes of the ear, the finest kind of 9 pence a drop. And now the wonderful little creatures were pink all over. It looked like a whole town of naked wild men. What have you there? Asked another old magician, who had no name, and that was the best thing about him. Yes, if you can guess what it is, said Cribble Crabble, I'll make you a present of it. But it's not so easy to find out if one does not know. And the magician, who had no name, looked through the magnifying glass. It looked really like a great town reflected there, in which all the people were running about without clothes. It was terrible, but it was still more terrible to see how one beat and pushed the other, and bit and hacked and tugged and mauled him. Those at the top were being pulled down. Those at the bottom were struggling upwards. Look, look, his leg is longer than mine. There, away with it. There is no one who has a little bruise. It hurts him, but it shall hurt him still more. And they hacked away at him, and they pulled at him, and ate him up, because of the little bruise. And there was one sitting as still as any little maiden, and wishing only for peace and quietness. But now she had to come out, and they tugged at her and pulled her about and ate her up. That's funny, said the magician. Yes, but what do you think it is? Said Cribble Crabble. Can you find out? Why, one can see that easily enough, said the other. That's Paris, or some other great city, but they're all alike. It's a great city. It's a drop of puddle water, said Cribble Crabble. The end. And there is a lesson in that also regarding what we see things as, I suppose, if you understand. I'll let you guess the lesson anyway. But he thought it was a town. He thought it was Paris, but it was a puddle. It was just a puddle. Thank you for listening to this tale and every sort of fairy tale from Hans Christian Andersen, especially the older ones. They are crazy. They are a little crazy, but they have a real important meaning. Many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. We are now on to another flower, but a different tale. This is called The Daisy. Now listen. In the country, close by the high road, stood a farmhouse. Perhaps you have passed by and seen it yourself. There was a little flower garden with painted wooden palings in front of it. Close by was a ditch. On its fresh green bank grew a little daisy. The sun shone as warmly and brightly upon it as the magnificent garden flowers. Therefore it thrived well. One morning it had quite opened, and its little snow-white petals stood round in yellow centre, like the rays of the sun. It did not mind that nobody saw it in the grass, and that it was a poor, despised flower. On the contrary, it was quite happy, turned upwards to the sun, looking upward, listening to the song of the lark high up in the air. The little daisy was so happy, as if the day had been a great holiday, but it was only Monday. All the children were at school, and while they were sitting on the forms and learning their lessons, it sat on its fingering stalk and learnt from the sun, from its surroundings, how kind God is. And it rejoiced that the song of the little lark expressed so sweetly and distinctly its own feelings. With a sort of reverence, the daisy looked up to the bird that could fly and sing, but it did not feel envious. I can see and hear, it thought. The sun shines upon me, and the forest kisses me. How rich I am. In the garden close by grew many large and magnificent flowers, and, strange to say, the less fragrance they had, the haughtier and prouder they were. The ponies puffed themselves up in order to be larger than the roses. But size is not everything. The tulips had the finest colours, but they knew it. They knew it very well too, for they were standing bolt upright like candles. but one might see them much better. In their pride, they did not see the little daisy, which looked over to them and thought, how rich and beautiful they are. I am sure the pretty bird will fly down and call upon them. Thank God that I stand so near and can at least see all the splendour. While the daisy was still thinking, the lark came flying down, crying, tweet, but not to the ponies, no, not to the tulips. Into the grass to the poor daisy. Its joy was so great that it did not know what to think. The little bird hopped round it and sang, how beautifully soft the grass is, and what lovely little flower with its golden heart and silver dress is growing here. The yellow centre in the daisy did indeed look like gold, while the white petals, well, they shone brightly as silver. How happy the daisy was! No one has the least idea. The bird kissed it with its beak, sang to it, and then rose up again to the blue sky. It was certainly more than a quarter of an hour before the daisy recovered its senses. Half ashamed, yet glad at heart, it looked over to the other flowers in the garden. Surely they had witnessed its pleasure and the honour that had been done to it. They understand its joy? But the tulips stood more stiffly than ever. Their faces were pointed and red because they were vexed. The ponies were sulky. It was well that they could not speak, otherwise they would have given the daisy a good lecture. The little flower could very well see that they were ill at ease, and pitied them sincerely. Shortly after this, a girl came into the garden with a large sharp knife. She went to the tulips and began cutting them off, one after another. Oh, sighed the daisy, that's terrible. Now they're done for. The girl carried the tulips away. The daisy was glad that it was outside, and only a small flower. It felt very grateful. At sunset it folded its petals and fell asleep, and dreamt all night of the sun and the little bird. On the following morning, when the flower once more stretched forth its tender petals, like little arms towards the air and the light, the daisy recognized the bird's voice. But what it sang sounded so sad. Indeed, the poor bird had good reason to be sad, for it had been caught and put into a cage close by the open window. It sang of the happy days when it could merrily fly about, of fresh green corn in the fields, and of time when it could soar almost up to the clouds. The poor lark was most unhappy as a prisoner in a cage. The little daisy would have liked so much to help it, but what could be done? Indeed, that was very difficult for such a small flower to find out. It entirely forgot how beautiful everything around it was, how warmly the sun was shining, how splendidly white its own petals were. It could only think of the poor captive bird, for which it could do nothing. Then 2 little boys came out of the garden. One of them had a large sharp knife, like that with which the girl had cut the tulips. They came straight towards the little daisy, which could not understand what they wanted. Here is a fine piece of turf for the lark, said one of the boys, and began to cut out a square all the way around the daisy, so that it remained in the centre of the grass. Pluck the flower off, said the other boy, and the daisy trembled for fear, for to be pulled off meant death to it, and it wished as much to live as it was to go with the square of turf into the poor captive lark's cage. No, let it stay, said the other boy. It looks so pretty. And so it stayed, and was brought into the lark's cage. The poor bird was lamenting its lost liberty, and beating its wings against the wires, and the little daisy could not speak or utter a consoling word, such as it would have liked to do so. So the forenoon passed. I have no water, said the captive lark. They have all gone out and forgotten to give me anything to drink. My throat is dry and burning. I feel as if I had fire and ice within me, and the air is so oppressive. Alas, I must die and part with the warm sunshine, the fresh green meadows, and all the beauty that God has created. As it thrust its beak into the piece of grass to refresh itself a little, then it noticed the little daisy, and nodded to it, and kissed it with its beak, and said, You must also fade and hear, poor little flower. You and the piece of grass are all they have given me in exchange for a whole world, which I enjoyed outside. Each little blade of grass shall be a green tree for me. Each of your white petals a fragrant flower. Alas, you only remind me of what I have lost. I wish I could console the poor lark, thought the daisy. It could not move one of its leaves, but the fragrance of its delicate petals streamed forth, and was much stronger than such flowers usually have. The bird noticed it, and thought it was dying with thirst. In its pain, tore up the green blades of grass, but did not touch the flower. The evening came. Nobody appeared to bring the poor bird a drop of water. It opened its beautiful wings and fluttered about in anguish. A faint and mournful tweet, tweet was all it could utter. Then it bent its little head towards the flower, and its heart broke for want of longing. The flower could not, as the previous evening, fold up its petals and sleep. It dropped sorrowfully. The boys came in the next morning, and when they saw the dead bird, they began to cry bitterly, dug a nice grave for it, and adorned it with flowers. The bird's body was placed in a pretty red box. They wished to bury it with royal honours. While it was alive and sang, they forgot it and let it suffer, wanting in the cage. Now they cried over it and covered it with flowers. The piece of turf with a little date on it was thrown out on a dusty highway. Nobody thought of the flower, which had felt so much for the bird, and had so greatly desired to comfort it. The end. And that is the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale of the Daisy. And there's a very important lesson to be had in this story. Please type in the comments. Guess what the lesson might be. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. He's a very well-known fairy tale teller, I guess, or writer of fairy tales. Anyway, if you hear a dog snoring, it's Dougal. It's usually Dougal, more often than not, and I apologise. Do remember, I do love to hear what you think the moral of the story is, the lesson in the story, because Hans Christian Andersen has a way of telling the stories and making them rather confusing. So it's fun to read your comments, see if you can understand what the story is really about. This one's called The Children's Prattle. At a rich merchant's house there was a children's party, and the children of rich and great people were there. The merchant was a learned man, for his father had sent him to college, and he had passed his examination. His father had been at first only a cattle dealer, but always honest and industrious, so that he had made money, and his son, the merchant, had managed to increase his store. Clever as he was, he had also a heart. But there was less said of the heart than of his money. All descriptions of people visited at the same merchant's house, well-born, well or intellectual, and some possessed neither of these recommendations. Now, it was a children's party, and there was children's prattle, which always is spoken freely from the heart. Among them was a beautiful little girl, who was terribly proud, but this had been taught to her by the servants, and not by her parents, who were far too sensible people. Her father was a groom of the chambers, which is high office at the court, and she knew it. I am a child of the court, she said. Now she might just as well have been a child of the cellar, for no one can help this birth. And then she told the other children that she was well born, and said that no one who was not well born could rise in the world. It was no use to read and be industrious. For if a person was not well born, he could never achieve anything. And those whose names end with sen, said she, can never be anything at all. We must put our arms akimbo and make the elbow quite pointed, as so to keep these sen people at the great distance. And then she stuck out her pretty little arms and made the elbows quite pointed to show how it was to be done. And the little arms were very pretty, for she was a sweet-looking child. But the little daughter of the merchant became very angry at this speech, for her father's name was Peterson, and she knew that the name ended in sen, and therefore she said as proudly as she could, "But my papa can buy $100 worth of bonbons and give them away to children. Can your papa do that?" "Yes, and my papa," said the little daughter of the editor of the paper. "My papa can put your papa and everybody's papa in the newspaper. All sorts of people are afraid of him, my mamma says, for he can do as he likes with the paper." And the little maiden looked exceedingly proud, as if she had been a real princess, who may be expected to look proud. But outside the door, which stood ajar, was a poor boy, peeping through the crack of the door. He was of such a lowly station that he had not been allowed to enter the room. He had been turning the spit for the cook, and she had given him permission to stand behind the door and peep in at the well-dressed children, who were having such a merry time within, and for him that was a great deal. "Oh, if I could be one of them," thought he. And then he heard what was said about names, which was quite enough to make him more unhappy. His parents at home had not even a penny to spare to buy a newspaper, much less could they write him one, and worse than all, his father's name, and of course his own, ended in sen, and therefore he would never turn out well, which was a very sad thought. But after all, he had been born into the world, and the station of life had been chosen for him. Therefore, he must be content. And this is what happened on that evening. Many years passed. Most of the children became grown-up persons. There stood a splendid house in town, filled with all kinds of beautiful and valuable objects. Everybody wished to see it. And people came. They came from country to country round to be permitted to view the treasures it contained. Which of the children, whose prattle we have described, could call the house his own? One would suppose it very easy to guess. No, it is not so very easy. The house belonged to the poor little boy who had stood on that night behind the door. He had really become something great, although his name ended in sen, for it was Thorwaldsen. And the three other children, the children of good birth, of money, intellectual pride, well, they were respected and honoured in the world, but they had been well provided for by birth and position, and they had no cause to reproach themselves with what they had thought and spoken on that evening long ago, for after all, it were mere children's prattle. The end. Children's prattle means children's talk. You know, children, they have a different way of speaking than adults do, and it's always quite funny to listen. There's a very important lesson in that to be learned. Can you guess it? Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel and the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. This one's called Delaying is Not Forgetting. There was an old mansion surrounded by a marshy ditch, with a drawbridge which was but seldom let down. Not all guests are good people. Under the roof were loopholes to shoot through, and to pour down boiling water or even molten lead on the enemy, should he approach. Inside the house, the rooms were very high and had ceilings of beams. These were very, very useful, considering the great deal of smoke which rose up from the chimney fire where the large damp logs of wood smouldered. On the walls hung pieces and pictures of knights in armour and proud ladies in gorgeous dresses. The most stately of all walked about alive. She was called Meta Morgan. She was the mistress of the house. To her belonged the castle. Towards the evening robbers came. They killed 3 of her people and also the yard dog, and attached Mrs. Meta to the kennel by the chain, while they themselves made good cheer in the hall and drank the wine and the good ale out of her cellar. Mrs. Meta was now on the chain. She could not even bark, but lo, the servant of one of the robbers secretly approached her. They must not see it, otherwise they would have killed him. Mrs. Meta Morgan, said the fellow, do you still remember how my father, when your husband was still alive, had to ride on the wooden horse? You prayed for him, but it was no good. He was to ride until his limbs were paralyzed, but you stole down to him, and now I steal to you. You yourself put little stones under each of his left feet, that he might have support. Nobody saw it, or they pretended not to see it, for you were then the young gracious mistress. My father has told me this, and I've not forgotten it. Now I will free you, Mrs. Meta Morgan. Then they pulled the horses out of the stable and rode off in the rain and wind to obtain the assistance of friends. Thus the small service done to the old man was richly rewarded, said Meta Morgan. Delaying is not forgetting, said the fellow. The robbers were hanged. There was an old mansion. It is still there. It did not belong to Mrs. Meta Morgan. It belonged to another old noble family. We are now in the present time. The sun is shining on the gilt knob of the tower. Little wooded islands lie like bouquets on the water, and wild swans are swimming round them. In the garden grow roses. The mistress of the house is herself the finest rose petal. She beams with joy, the joy of good deeds. However, not done in the wide world, but in her heart, and what is preserved there is not forgotten. Delaying is not forgetting. Now she goes from the mansion to a little peasant hut in the field. Therein lives a poor paralyzed girl. The window of a little room looks northward. The sun does not enter here. The girl can only see a small piece of field which is surrounded by a high fence. But today the sun shines here. The warm, beautiful Son of God is within the little room. It comes from the south through the new window, where formerly the wall was. The paralyzed girl sits in the warm sunshine and can see the wood and the lake. The world had become so large, so beautiful, and only through a single word from the kind mistress of the mansion. The word was so easy, the deed so small, she said. The joy it afforded me was infinitely great and sweet, and therefore she does many a good deed. Thinks of all in humble cottages and in the rich mansions, where there are also afflicted ones. It is concealed and hidden, but God does not forget it. Delayed is not forgotten. An old house stood there. It was in the large town with its busy traffic. There are rooms and halls in it, but we do not enter them. We remain in the kitchen, where it's warm and light, clean and tidy. The copper utensils are shining. The table as if polished with beeswax. The sink looks a freshly scoured meat board. All things single servant has done, and yet she has time to spare as if she wished to go to church. She wears a bow on her cap, a black bow that signifies mourning. But she has no one to mourn, neither father nor mother, neither relations nor sweetheart. She is a poor girl. One day she was engaged to a poor fellow. They loved each other deeply. One day he came to her and said, "We both have nothing. The rich widow over the way in the basement has made advances to me. She will make me rich, but you are in my heart. What do you advise me to do?" "I advise you to do what you think will turn out to your happiness," said the girl. "Be kind and good to her, but remember this, from the hour we part, we shall never see each other again." Years passed. Then one day, she met the old friend and sweetheart in the street. He looked ill and miserable, and she could not help asking him, "How are you?" "Rich and prospering in every respect," he said. "The woman is brave and good, but you are in my heart. I have fought the battle. It will soon be ended. We shall not see each other again now until we meet before God." A week has passed. This morning his death was in the newspaper. That is the reason of the girl's mourning. Her old sweetheart is dead and has left a wife and 3 stepchildren, as the paper says. It sounds that there's a crack, but the metal is pure. The black bow signifies mourning. The girl's face points to the same in a still higher degree. It is preserved in the heart and will never be forgotten. Delaying is not forgetting. There are 3 stories, you see. 3 leaves on the same stalk. Do you wish for some more trefoil leaves? In this little heart book are many more of them, because delaying is never forgetting. And that's delaying is not forgetting. Again, those 3 stories are interlinked somehow, and there's a lesson in them. I'd like you to guess in the comments, because I think it's a really good game. I love seeing people's comments to what they think the fairy tale actually means. Always makes me smile. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, The Fairytales of Hans Christian Andersen. This is the Dumb Book. In the high road which led through a wood stood a solitary farmhouse. The road, in fact, ran right through its yard. The sun was shining and all the windows were open. Within the house people were very busy. In the yard, in an arbor formed by lilac bushes in full bloom, stood an open coffin. Thither they had carried a dead man, who was to be buried that very afternoon. Nobody shed a tear over him. His face was covered over with a white cloth. Under his head they had placed a large, thick book, the leaves of which consisted of folded sheets of blotting paper, and withered flowers lay between them. It was the herbarium, which had been gathered in various places and was to be burned with him according to his own wish. Every one of the flowers in it was connected with some chapter of his life. "Who is the dead man?" we asked. "The old student," was the reply. "They say that he was once an energetic young man, that he studied the dead languages and sang and even composed many songs. Then something had happened to him, and in consequence of this he gave himself up to drink, body and mind. When at last he had ruined his health, they brought him into the country, where someone paid for his board and residence. He was gentle as a child, as long as the sullen mood did not come over him. But when it came, he was fierce, became as strong as a giant, ran about in the wood like a chased deer. But when we succeeded in bringing him home, and prevailed upon him to open the book with the dried up plants in it. He would sometimes sit for a whole day looking at this or that plant, while frequently the tears rolled over his cheeks. God knows what was in his mind, but he requested us to put the book into his coffin, and now he lies there. In a little while the lid will be placed upon the coffin, and he will have sweet rest in the grave. The cloth which covered up his face was lifted up. The dead man's face expressed peace. A sunbeam fell upon it. A swallow flew with the swiftness of an arrow into the arbour, turning in its flight, and twittered over the dead man's hand, then his head. What a strange feeling it is. Surely we all know it, to look through our letters of our young days. A different life rises up out of the past, as it were, with all its hopes and sorrows. How many of the people with whom in those days we used to be on intimate terms appear to us as if dead, and yet they are still alive, only we have not really thought of them for such a long time, whom we imagined we should retain in our memories forever, and share every joy and sorrow with them. The withered oak leaf in the book here recalled the friend, the schoolfellow, who was to be his friend for life. He fixed the leaf to the student's cap in the green wood, when they vowed eternal friendship. Where does he dwell now? The leaf is kept, but the friendship does no longer exist. Here is a foreign hothouse plant, too tender for the gardens of the north. It is almost as if its leaves still smelt sweet. She gave it to him out of her own garden, a nobleman's daughter. Here is a water lily that had plucked himself in water with salt tears, a lily of sweet water, and here is a nettle. What may its leaves tell us? What might he have thought when he plucked and kept it? Here is a little snowdrop out of the solitary wood. Here is an evergreen from the flower pot at the tavern, and here a simple blade of grass. The lilac bends its fresh fragrant flowers over the dead man's head. The swallow passes again, twit, twit. Now the men come with the hammer and nails. The lid is placed over the dead man, while his head rests on the dumb book, so long cherished, now closed, forever. The end. And that is the story of The Dumb Book by Hans Christian Andersen. Of course, there's a lesson to be told in it as usual, but thank you for listening and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel and the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. Very, very famous fairy tale teller. The Elf of the Rose is what this one is called. In the midst of a garden grew a rose tree in full blossom, and in the priest of all the roses lived an elf. He was such a little wee thing that no human eye could see him. Behind each leaf of the rose he had a sleeping chamber. He was well formed and as beautiful as a little child could be, and had wings that reached from his shoulders to his feet. Oh, what a sweet fragrance there was in his chambers, and how clean and beautiful were the walls, for they were the blushing leaves of the rose. During the whole day he enjoyed himself in the warm sunshine, flew from flower to flower, danced on the wings of flying butterflies. Then he took it into his head to measure how many steps he would have to go through the roads and crossroads that are on each of the leaf of the linden tree. What we call the veins on a leaf, he took up for roads. Aye, and very long roads they were for him, For before he had half finished his task, the sun went down. He had commenced his work too late. It became very cold. The dew fell and the wind blew. So he thought the best thing he could do would be return home. He hurried himself as much as he could, but he found the roses all closed up, and he could not get in. Not a single rose stood open. The poor little elf was very much frightened. He'd never been out at night, but had always slumbered secretly behind the warm rose leaves. Oh, this would certainly be his death. At the other end of the garden, he knew there was an arbour overgrown with beautiful honeysuckles. The blossoms looked like large painted horns, and he thought to himself he would go to sleep in one of these till the morning. He flew thither, but hush! Two people were in the harbour, a handsome young man and a beautiful lady. They sat side by side, and wished they might never be obliged to part. They loved each other much more than the best child can love its father and mother. But we must part, said the young man. Your brother does not like our engagement, and therefore he sends me so far away on business, over mountains and seas. Farewell, my sweet bride, for so you are to me. Then they kissed each other, and the girl wept, and gave him a rose. But before she did so, she pressed a kiss upon it so fervently that the flower opened. Then the little elf flew in, and leaned his head on the delicate, fragile walls. Here he could plainly hear them say, farewell, farewell, and he felt that the rose had been placed on the young man's breast. How his heart did beat! The little elf could not go to sleep. It thumped so loudly. The young man took it out as he walked through the dark wood alone, and kissed the flower so often and so violently that the little elf was almost crushed. He could feel through the leaf how the hot lips of the young man were, and the rose had opened, and if from the heat of the noonday sun it was. There came another man who looked gloomy and wicked. He was the wicked brother of the beautiful maiden. He drew out a sharp knife, and while the other was kissing the rose, the wicked man stabbed him to death. Then he cut off his head, and buried it with the body in the soft earth under the linden tree. Now he is gone, and will soon be forgotten, thought the wicked brother. He will never come back again. He was going on a long journey over the mountains and seas. It's easy for a man to lose his life in such a journey. My sister will suppose he is dead, for he cannot come back, and she will not dare to question me about him. Then he scattered the dry leaves over the light earth with his foot, went home through the darkness. But he went not alone, as he thought. The little elf accompanied him. He sat in the dried up linden leaf, which had fallen from the tree on the wicked man's head. And this happened as he was digging the grave. The hat was on the head now, which made it very dark. The little elf shuddered with fright and indignation at the wicked deed. It was the dawn of morning before the wicked man reached home. He took off his hat and went into his sister's room. There lay the beautiful, blooming girl, dreaming of him whom she loved so, and was now, she supposed, travelling far away over mountain and sea. Her wicked brother stopped over her and laughed hideously, as fiends can only laugh. The dry leaf fell out of his hair upon the counterpane, but he did not notice it. I went to get a little sleep during the early morning hours, but the elf slipped out of the withered leaf, placed himself by the ear of the sleeping girl, and told her, as in a dream, of the horrid murder, described the place where her brother had slain a lover and buried his body, told her of the linden tree in full bloom that stood close by. But you may not think this is only a dream what I have told you, he said. You will find on your bed a withered leaf. Then she woke and found it there. Oh, what tears she shed. She could not open her heart to anyone for relief. The window stood open the whole day, and the little elf could easily have reached the roses or any of the flowers, but he could not find it in his heart to leave one so afflicted. In the window stood a bush, bearing monthly roses. He seated himself in one of the flowers and gazed at the poor girl. Her brother often came into the room and would be quite cheerful, in spite of his base conduct, so she dare not say a word to him of her heart's grief. As soon as night came on, she slipped out of the house, went into the wood, to the spot where the linden tree stood, and after removing the leaves from the earth, she turned it up, and there found him who had been murdered. Oh, how she wept and prayed that she also might die. Gladly would she have taken the body home with her, but that was impossible. So she took up the poor head with the closed eyes, kissed the cold lips, and shook the mould out of the beautiful hair. I will keep this, said she, and as soon as the body is recovered again with the earth and leaves, I will put them together. She took the head and a little sprig of jasmine that bloomed in the wood, near the spot where he was buried, and carried them home with her. As soon as she was in her room, she took the largest flower pot she could find, and in she placed the head of the dead man, covered it up with earth, and planted a twig of jasmine in it. Farewell, farewell, whispered the little elf. He could not any longer endure the witness all the agony of grief. He therefore flew away to his own rose in the garden. But the rose was faded. Only a few dry leaves still clung to the green edge behind it. Alas, how soon all that is good and beautiful passes away, sighed the elf. After a while he found another rose, which became his home, for among its delicate, fragrant leaves he could dwell in safety. Every morning he flew to the window of the poor girl and always found her weeping by the flower pot. The bitter tears fell upon the jasmine twig, and each day, as she became paler and paler, the sprig appeared to grow greener and fresher. One shoot after another sprouted forth. Little white buds blossomed, which the poor girl fondly kissed. But her wicked brother scolded her and asked her if she was going mad. He could not imagine why she was weeping over the flower pot, and it annoyed him. He did not know whose eyes closed were there, nor what red lips were fading beneath the earth. And one day she sat and leaned her head against the flower pot, and the little elf with the rose found her asleep. Then he seated himself by her here, talked to her of that evening in the arbour, of the sweet perfume of the rose, and the love of the elves. Sweetly she dreamed. While she dreamt, her life passed calmly and gently, and her spirit was with whom she loved in heaven. And the jasmine opened its white bells and spread forth its sweet fragrance. It had no other way of showing its grief for the dead. But the wicked brother considered the beautiful blooming plant as his own property, left to him by his sister, and placed it in his sleeping room close by his bed. For it was very lovely in appearance, and the fragrance sweet and delightful. The little elf of the rose followed it, and flew from flower to flower, telling each little spirit that dwelt in them the story of the murdered young man, whose head now formed part of the earth beneath them, and of the poor girl, the wicked brother. We know it, said each little spirit in the flowers. We know it, but we have not sprung from the eyes and lips of the murdered one. We know it, we know it. And the flowers nodded, with their heads in a peculiar manner. The elf of the rose could not understand how they could rest so quietly in the matter, so he flew to the bees who were gathering honey, and told them of the wicked brother. And the bees told it to their queen, who commanded that the next morning they should go kill the murderer. But during the night, the first after his sister's death, while the brother was sleeping in his bed, close to where he had placed the fragrant jasmine, every flower cup opened, and, invisibly, the little spirits stole out, armed with poisonous spears. They placed themselves by the ear of the sleeper, told him dreadful dreams, and then flew across his lips and pricked his tongue with their poisonous spears. Now have we revenged the dead, said they, and flew back into the white bells of the jasmine flowers. When the morning came, And as soon as the window was opened, the rose elf with the queen bee and a whole swarm of bees rushed in to kill him, but he was already dead. People were standing round the bed and saying that the scent of jasmine had killed him. Then the elf of the rose understood the revenge of the flowers and explained it to the queen bee, and she, with the whole swarm, buzzed about the flower pot. The bees could not be driven away. Then a man took it up to remove it, and one of the bees stung him in the hand, so that he left the flower pot full, and it was broken to pieces. Then everyone saw the whitened skull, and they knew the dead man in the bed was a murderer. And the queen bee hummed in the air and sang of the revenge of the flowers and of the elf of the rose, and said that behind the smallest leaf dwells one who can discover evil deeds and punish them also. The end. And that is the story of The Elf in the Rose by Hans Christian Andersen. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Wysteria here. Now this is a tale that most people will know, The Little Mermaid, but is the original Little Mermaid from Hans Christian Andersen. So, shall we see if there is any difference in this Little Mermaid and the other Disney Little Mermaid? I'm guessing there's going to be some differences, but also likenesses. Far out in the ocean, where the water is as blue as the prettiest cornflower and as clear as a crystal, it is very, very deep. So deep, indeed, that no cable could fathom it. Many church steeples piled one upon another would not reach from the ground beneath to the surface of the water above, that dwell the Sea King and his subjects. We must not imagine that there is nothing at the bottom of the sea but bare yellow sand. No, indeed, the most singular flowers and plants grow there, the leaves and stems of which are so pliant, and the slightest agitation of the water causes them to stir as if they had life. Fishes, both large and small, glide between the branches, as birds fly among the trees here upon land. In the deepest spot of all stands the castle of the Sea King. Its walls are built of coral, and the long Gothic windows are of the clearest amber. The roof is formed of shells that open and close as the water flows over them. Their appearance is very beautiful, for in each lies a glittering pearl which would fit for the diadem of a queen. The Sea King has been a widower for many years, and his aged mother kept house for him. She was a very wise woman, and exceedingly proud of her high birth. On that account, she wore 12 oysters on her tail, while others, also of high rank, were only allowed to wear 6. She was, however, deserving of very great praise, especially for her care of the little sea princesses, her granddaughters. They were 6 beautiful children, but the youngest was the prettiest of them all. Her skin was as clear and delicate as a rose leaf, and her eyes as blue as the deepest sea. But, like all the others, she had no feet, and her body ended in a fish's tail. All day long they played in the great halls of the castle, or among the living flowers that grew out of the walls. The large amber windows were open, and the fish swam in, just as the swallows fly into our houses when we open the windows. Excepting that fishes swam up to the little princesses, ate out of their hands, and allowed themselves to be stroked. Outside the castle there was a beautiful garden, in which grew bright red and dark blue flowers, and blossoms like flames of fire. The fruit glittered gold, and the leaves and stems waved to and fro continually. The earth itself was the finest sand, but blue as the flame of burning sulphur. Over everything lay a peculiar blue radiance, as if it were surrounded by the air from above, through which the blue sky shone instead of the dark depths of the sea. In calm weather, the sun could be seen, looking like a purple flower, with the light streaming from the calyx. Each of the young princesses had a little plot of ground in the garden, where she might dig and plant as she pleased. One arranged her flower bed into the form of a whale. Another thought it better to make hers like the figure of a little mermaid, but that of the youngest was round like the sun, and contained flowers as red as his rays at sunset. She was a strange, quiet child, but rather thoughtful she was, and while her sisters would be delighted with the wonderful things which they obtained from the wrecks of vessels, she cared for nothing but her pretty red flowers, like the sun, excepting a beautiful marble statue. It was the representation of a handsome boy, carved out of pure white stone, which had fallen to the bottom of the sea from a wreck. She planted the statue, a rose-coloured willow weeping tree. Yes, in the sea, that's what it was put by. It grew splendidly, and very soon hung its fresh branches over the statue, almost down to the blue sands. The shadow had a violent tint, and waved to and fro like the branches. It seemed as if the crown of the tree and the root were at play, and trying to kiss each other. Nothing gave her so much pleasure as to hear about the world above the sea. She made her old grandmother tell her of all she knew of the ships and of the towns, the people and the animals. To her it seemed most wonderful and beautiful to hear that the flowers of the land should have fragrance, and not those below the sea. That the trees of the forest should be green, and that the fishes among the trees could sing so sweetly, that it was quite a pleasure to hear them. Her grandmother called the little birds fishes. Oh, she would not have understood what her grandmother was saying, for she'd never actually seen birds. When you have reached your 15th year, said grandmother, you'll have permission to rise up out of the sea, to sit on the rocks in the moonlight while the great ships are sailing by. Then you will see both forests and towns. In the following year, one of the sisters would be 15, but as each was a year younger than the other, the youngest would have to wait 5 years before her turn came to rise up from the bottom of the ocean and see the earth as they do. However, each promised to tell the others what she saw on her first visit and what she thought the most beautiful, for their grandmother could not tell them enough. There were so many things on which they wanted information. None of them longed so much for her turn to come as the youngest. She who had the longest time to wait, and who was so quiet and thoughtful. Many nights she stood by the open window looking up through the dark blue water, and watching the fish as they splashed about with their fins and tails. She could see the moon and stars shining faintly, but through the water they looked larger than they do to our eyes. When something like a black cloud passed between her and them, she knew it was either a whale swimming over her head, or a ship full of human beings, who never imagined that a pretty little mermaid was standing beneath them, holding out her white hands towards the keel of their ship. As soon as the eldest was 15, she was allowed to rise to the surface of the ocean. When she came back, she had hundreds of things to talk about, but the most beautiful, she said, was to lie in the moonlight on the sandbank in the quiet sea near the coast, and to gaze on a large town nearby, where the lights were twinkling like hundreds of stars, to listen to the sounds of music, the noise of carriages, and the voices of human beings, and then to hear the merry bells peal out from the church steeples. And because she could not go near all these wonderful things, she longed for them more than ever. Oh, did not the youngest sister listen eagerly to all these descriptions? And afterwards, when she stood at the open window looking up through the dark blue water, she thought of the great city with all the bustle and noise, and even fancied she could hear the sound of church bells down in the depths of the sea. In another year, The second sister received her permission to rise above the surface of the water and to swim about where she pleased. She rose just as the sun was setting, and this, she said, was the most beautiful night of all. The whole sky looked like gold, while violet and rose-coloured clouds, which she could not describe, floated over her, and still more rapidly than clouds flew a large flock of wild swans towards the setting sun, looking like a long white veil across the sea. She also swam towards the sun, but it sunk into the waves, and the rosy tints faded from the clouds and from the sea. The third sister's turn followed. She was boldest of all of them, and she swam up a broad river that emptied itself into the sea. On the bank she saw green hills covered with beautiful vines. Palaces and castles peeped out from amid the proud trees of the forest. She heard the birds singing, and the rays of the sun were so powerful that she was obliged to often dive down under the water to cool her burning face. In a narrow creek she found a whole troop of little human children, quite naked, and sporting about in water. She wanted to play with them, but they fled in great fright. And then a little black animal came in the water. It was a dog, but she did not know that, for she had never seen one before. The animal barked at her terribly that she became frightened and rushed back to the open sea. But she said she'd never forget that beautiful forest, the green hills, and the pretty little children who could swim in the water, although they had no fish's tails. The fourth sister was more timid. She remained in the midst of the sea, but she said it was quite a beautiful place there nearer the land. She could see for so many miles around her, and the sky above looked like a bell of glass. She had seen the ships, but at such a great distance they looked like seagulls. The dolphins sported in the waves, and the great whales spouted water from their nostrils, till it seemed as if 100 fountains were playing in every direction. The fifth sister's birthday occurred in the winter, so when her turn came, she saw what the others had not seen the first time they went up. The sea looked quite green, and large icebergs were floating about, each like a pearl, she said, but larger and loftier than the churches built by men. They were of the most singular shapes and glittered like diamonds. She had seated herself upon one of the largest and let the wind play with her long hair. She remarked that all the ships that sailed by rapidly and steered as far away as they could from the iceberg, as if they were afraid of it. Towards evening, as the sun went down, the dark clouds covered the sky, the thunder rolled and the lightning flashed, and the red light glowed on the icebergs as they rocked and tossed on the heaving sea. On all the ships, the sails were reefed with fear and trembling, while she sat calmly on a floating iceberg, watching the blue lightning as it darted its forked flashes into the sea. When first the sisters had permission to rise to the surface, they were each delighted with the new and beautiful sights they saw. But now, as grown-up girls, they could go when they pleased, and they had become indifferent about it. They wished themselves back again in the water, and after a month had passed, they said it was much more beautiful down below, and pleasanter to be at home. Yet often in the evening hours, the five sisters would twine their arms round each other and rise to the surface in a row. They had more beautiful voices than any human being could have. And before the approach of a storm, and when they expected a ship would be lost, they swam before the vessel and sang sweetly of the delights to be found in the depths of the sea, begging the sailors not to fear if they sank to the bottom. But the sailors could not understand the song, so they took it for the howling of the storm. Yes, and these things were never to be beautiful for them, for if the ship sank, the men were drowned. Their dead bodies alone reached the palace of the Sea King. When the sisters rose arm in arm through the water in that way, their youngest sister would stand quite alone, looking after them, ready to cry, only that the mermaids have no tears, and therefore they suffer more. Oh, were I but 15 years old, she said, I knew that I shall love the world up there and all the people who live in it. But at last, she reached the 15th year. Well, now you are grown up, said the old dowager, her grandmother. So you must let me adorn you like your other sisters, and be placed a wreath of white lilies in her hair, and every flower leaf was like a pearl. Then the old lady ordered 8 great oysters to attach themselves to the tail of the princess to show her high rank. But they hurt me so, said the little mermaid. Pride must suffer pain, replied the old lady. Oh, how gladly she would have shaken off all the grandeur and laid aside the heavy wreath. The red flowers in her own garden would have suited her much better, but she could not help herself. So she said, farewell, and rose as lightly as a bubble to the surface of the water. The sun had just set as she raised her head above the waves, but the clouds were tinted with crimson and gold, and through the glimmering twilight beamed the evening star in all its beauty. The sun was calm, the air mild, and fresh. A large ship with 3 masts lay becalmed on the water, with only one sail set, for not a breeze stifled, and the sailors sat idle on the deck or amongst their rigging. There was music and song on board, and darkness came on. 100 coloured lanterns were lighted, as if the flags of all nations waved in the air. The little mermaid swam close to the cabin windows, and now and then, as the waves lifted her up, she could look in through the clear glass window panes and see a number of well-dressed people within. Among them was a young prince, the most beautiful of all, with large black eyes. He was 16 years of age, and his birthday was being kept with much rejoicing. The sailors were dancing on deck, but when the prince came out of the cabin, more than 100 rockets rose into the air, making it as bright as day. The little mermaid was startled that she dived under water, and when she again stretched out her hand, it appeared as if all the stars of heaven were falling around her. She'd never seen such fireworks before. Great suns spurted fire out and about. Splendid fireflies flew into the blue air, and everything was reflected in the clear, calm sea beneath. The ship itself was brightly illuminated, but all the people and even the smallest rope could be distinctly and plainly seen. And how handsome the young prince looked, as he pressed the hands of all present and smiled at them, while the music resounded through the clear night air. It was very late, yet the little mermaid could not take her eyes from the ship or from the beautiful prince. The coloured lanterns had been extinguished, no more rockets rose in the air, and the cannon had ceased firing. But the sea became restless, and a moaning, grumbling sound could be heard beneath the waves. Still the little mermaid remained by the cabin window, rocking up and down on the water, which enabled her to look in. After a while, the sails were quickly unfurled, and the noble ship continued her passage. But soon the waves were higher. Heavy clouds darkened the sky. Lightning appeared in the distance. A dreadful storm was approaching. Once more the sails were reefed, and the great ship pursued her flying course over the raging sea. The waves rose mountains high, as if they would overlap the mast. But the ship dived like a swan between them, and then rose again on lofty foaming crests. To the little mermaid this appeared pleasant sport. Not so to the sailors. At length the ship groaned and creaked. The thick planks gave way under the lashing of the sea as it broke over the deck. The mainmast snapped asunder like a reed. The ship lay over on her side, and the water rushed in. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew were in danger. Even she herself was obliged to be careful to avoid the beams and planks of wreck which lay scattered on the water. At one moment it was pitch dark, that she could not see a single object, but a flash of lightning revealed this whole scene. She could see everyone who had been aboard excepting the prince. When the ship parted, she had seen him sink into the deep waves, and she was glad, for she thought he would now be with her. And then she remembered that human beings could not live in water. So that's when he got down into her father's palace. She would find that he would be quite dead, but he must not die. So she swam about amongst the beams and planks, endlessly swerving and strewed from surface to surface in sea, forgetting that they could crush her in pieces. Then she dived deeply under the dark waters, rising and falling with waves, till at length she managed to reach the young prince, who was fast losing the power of swimming in that stormy sea, his limbs failing him, his beautiful eyes were closed, and he would have died had not the little mermaid come to his assistance. She held his head above the water and let the waves drift them where they would. In the morning the storm had ceased, but of the ship not a single fragment could be seen. The sun rose up red, glowing from the water, and its beams brought back the blue of health to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high smooth forehead and stroked back his wet hair. He seemed to her like the marble statue in a little garden, and she kissed him again and wished that he might live. Presently they came in sight of land. She saw lofty blue mountains on which the white snow rested as if a flock of swans were lying upon them. Near the coast were beautiful green forests. Close by stood a large building, whether a church or a convent she could not tell. Orange and citron trees grew in the garden, and before the door stood lofty palms. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite still, but very deep, so she swam with the handsome prince to the beach, which was covered with fine white sand, and there she laid him in the warm sunshine, taking care to rise his head, then his body. Then bells sounded in the large white building, and a number of young girls came into the garden. The little mermaid swam out further from the shore and placed herself between some high rocks that rose out of the water. Then she covered her head and neck with the foam of the sea, so that the little face might not be seen, and watched to see what would become of the poor prince. She did not wait long before she saw a young girl approach the spot where he lay. She seemed frightened at first, but only for a moment. Then she fetched a number of people, and the mermaid saw that the prince come to life again. And she smiled. She smiled upon those who stood around him. But to her he sent no smile. He knew not that she had saved him. This made her very unhappy. And when he was led away into the great building, she dived down sorrowfully into the water, returned to her father's castle. She'd always been silent and thoughtful. Now she was more so than ever. Her sisters asked her what she had been doing during her visit, what had she seen at the surface of the water, but she would not tell them anything. Many an evening and morning did she rise to the place where she left the prince. She saw the fruits in the garden ripen till they were gathered. The snow on tops of the mountains melt away, but she never saw the prince. Therefore she returned home, always more sorrowful than before. It was her only comfort to sit in her own little garden and fling her arm around the beautiful marble statue, which was like the prince. But she gave up tending to the flowers. They grew in a wild confusions over the paths, twining their long leaves and stems round the branches of the trees, so the whole place became dark and gloomy. At length she could bear it no longer and told one of her sisters all about it. Then the others heard the secret, and very soon it became known. The two mermaids, whose intimate friend happened to know who the prince was. She had also seen the festival on board ship, and she told them where the prince came from and where his palace stood. "Come, little sister," said the princesses. Then they entwined their arms and rose up in a long row to the surface of the water, close by the spot where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of bright yellow shining stone, long flights of marble steps, one of which reached quite down to the sea. Splendid, gilded cupolas that rose over the roof, and between the pillars that surrounded the whole building stood lifelike statues of marble. Through the clear crystal of the lofty windows could be seen noble rooms, with costly silk curtains and hangings of tapestry, while the walls were covered with beautiful paintings, which were a pleasure to look at. In the centre of the largest saloon, a fountain threw its sparkling jets high up into the glass cupola of the ceiling, through which the sun shone down upon the water and upon the beautiful plants, growing round the basin of the fountain. Now that she knew where he lived, she spent many an evening and many a night on the water near the palace. She would swim much nearer the shore than any of the others ventured to do. Indeed, once she went quite up the narrow channel under the marble balcony, which threw a broad shadow on the water. Here she would sit. She would watch the young prince. Just watch. Who thought himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. She saw him many times of an evening, sailing in a pleasant little boat with music playing and flags waving. She peeped out from among the green rushes, and in the wind caught a long silvery white veil. Those who saw it believed it to be a swan, spreading out its wings. On many a night, too, when the fishermen, with their torches, were out at sea, she heard them relate so many good things about the doings of the young prince, that she was glad she had saved his life when he had been tossed about half dead on the waves. And she remembered that his head had rested on her bosom and how heartily she had kissed him. But she knew nothing of all this, and could not even dream of it. She grew more and more fond of human beings, and wished more and more to be able to wander about with those whose world seemed to be much larger than her own. They could fly over the sea in ships, mount the high hills which were far above the clouds, and the lands they possessed. Their woods, their fields stretched far away beyond the reach of her sight. There was so much that she wished to know, and her sisters were unable to answer all her questions. Then she applied to her old grandmother, who knew all about the upper world, which she rightly called lands above the sea. If human beings are not drowned, asked the little mermaid, can they live forever? Do they never die, as we do in the sea? Yes, replied the old lady, they must also die. Their term of life is shorter than ours. We sometimes live to 300 years, but when we create to exist here, we only come to the form, and we are then the form on the surface of the water, and we have not even a grave down here, not a grave of those we love. We have not immortal souls, we shall never live again, but like the green seaweed, when once it has been cut off, we can never flourish more. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, lives after the body has been turned to dust. It rises up through the clear, pure air beyond the glittering stars, as we rise out of the water, and behold all the land of the earth. So do they rise to unknown and glorious regions, which we shall never see. Why have we not an immortal soul? Asked the little mermaid mournfully. I would give gladly all the hundreds of years that I have to live to be a human being only for one day, and to have the hope of knowing the happiness of the glorious world above the stars. You must not think like that, said the old woman. We feel ourselves to be much happier and much better off than human beings. And that is the first part of the traditional Little Mermaid. As you can imagine, it's a longer story, so hey ho, it's going to be longer and I apologise. Thank you very much for listening to the first part of The Little Mermaid, and many blessings. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen and the continuation of The Little Mermaid, Part 2. Of course, I must remind you, this is the traditional Little Mermaid, not the Disney one, okay? So it's different. Let's continue with The Little Mermaid, Part 2. So I shall die, said the Little Mermaid, and as the foam of the sea I shall be driven about, never again to hear the music of the waves, or to see the pretty flowers, nor the red sun. Is there anything I can do to win an immortal soul? No, said the old woman, unless a man were to love you so much that you are more to him than his father and mother, and if all his thoughts and all his love were fixed upon you, and the priest placed his right hand in yours, and he promised to be true to you here and hereafter, then his soul would glide into your body and you would obtain and share in the future happiness of mankind. He would give his soul to you and retain his own as well, but this can never happen. Your fish's tail, which, amongst us is considered so beautiful, is thought on earth to be quite ugly. They do not know any better, and they think it's necessary to have two stout props, which they call legs, in order to be handsome. Then the little mermaid sighed and looked sorrowful at her fish's tail. "Let us be happy," said the old lady, "and dart and spring about during the 300 years that we have to live, which is really quite long enough. After that we can rest ourselves all the better. This evening we're going to have a court ball. It is one of those splendid sights which we can never see on earth. The walls and the ceilings of the large ballroom were of thick but transparent crystal. Many hundreds of colossal shells, some of deep red, others of grass green, stood on each side in rows, with blue fire in them, which lighted up the whole saloon and shone through the walls, so that the sea was also illuminated. Innumerable fishes, great and small, swam past the crystal walls. On some of them the scales glowed with a purple brilliancy. On others they shone like silver and gold. Through the halls flowed a broad stream, and in it danced the mermen and the mermaids to the music of their own sweet singing. No one on earth has such a lovely voice as theirs. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than them all. The whole court applauded her with hands and tails, and for a moment her heart felt quite gay, for she knew she had the loveliest voice of any on earth or in the sea. But she soon again thought of the world above her, for she had not forgot the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she had not an immortal soul like his. Therefore she crept away silently, out of her father's palace, and while everything was in the gladness and song, she sat in her own little garden, sorrowful and alone. Then she heard the bugles sounding through the water and thought, "He is certainly sailing above, he on whom my wishes depend, and in whose hands I should like to place the happiness of my life. I will venture all for him, and to win an immortal soul, while my sisters are dancing in the father's palace. I will go to the sea witch of whom I have always been so much afraid, for she can give me counsel and help." Then the little mermaid went out from her garden and took the road to the foaming whirlpools, behind which the sorceress lived. She'd never been that way before. Neither flowers nor grass grew there. Nothing but bare, grey, sandy ground stretched out to the whirlpool, where the water, like foaming mill-wheels, whirled round everything that it seized, cast it into a fathomless deep. Through the midst of these crushing whirlpools the little mermaid was obliged to pass, to reach the minions of Sea Witch, and also, for a long distance, the only road lay right across a quantity of warm, bubbling mire, called by the witch her turf moor. Beyond this stood her house, in the centre of a strange forest, which all the trees and flowers were polypi, half animals and half plants. They looked like serpents with hundreds of heads growing out of the ground. The branches were long, slimy arms with fingers like flexible worms, moving limb after limb from the root to the top. All that could be reached in the sea they seized upon and held fast, so that it never escaped from their clutches. The little mermaid was so alarmed at what she saw that she stood still, and her heart beat with fear. She was very nearly turning back, but she thought of the prince and of the human soul for which she longed, and her courage returned. She fastened her long flowing hair round her head, so that the polypi might not seize hold of it. She laid her hands together across her bosom. Then she darted forward as a fish shoots through water between the supple arms and fingers of the ugly polypi, which were stretched out to each side of her. She saw that each held in its grasp something it had seized, with its numerous arms, the white skeletons of human beings who had perished at sea, and had sunk down in the deep waters. Skeletons of land animals, oars, rudders, chests of ships were lying tightly grasped by their clinging arms. Even a little mermaid whom they had caught and strangled, and this seemed the most shocking of all to the little princess. She now came to a space of marshy ground in the wood, where large fat water snakes were rolling in the mire, showing their ugly drab-coloured bodies. In the midst of this spot stood a house built with the bones of shipwrecked human beings, many of them. There sat the sea witch, allowing a toad to eat from her mouth, just as people sometimes feed a canary with a piece of sugar. She called the ugly water snakes her little chickens, allowed them to crawl all over her bosom. I know what you want, said the sea witch. It's very stupid of you, but you shall have your way. It will bring you sorrow, my pretty princess. You want to get rid of your fish's tail, and to have two supports instead of it, like human beings on earth, so that the young prince may fall in love with you, and that you may have an immortal soul. Then the witch laughed so loud and disgustingly that the toad and the snakes fell to the ground. They lay there wriggling about. You are but just in time, said the witch, for after sunrise tomorrow I should not be able to help you till the end of another year. I will prepare a draught for you, with which you must swim to the land tomorrow before sunrise. Sit down on the shore and drink it. Your tail will disappear and shrink up into what mankind calls legs. You will feel great pain, as if a sword were passing through you. But all who see you will say you are the prettiest little human being they ever saw. You will still have the same floating gracefulness of movement, and no dancer will ever tread so lightly. But at every step you take, it will feel as if you were treading upon sharp knives, and that the blood must flow. If you will bear all this, I will help you. Yes, I will, said the little princess, because she thought of her prince and the immortal soul. But think again, said the witch, for when once your shape has become like a human being, you can no more be a mermaid. You will never return through the water to your sisters or to your father's palace, and if you do not win the love of the prince, so that he is willing to forget his father and mother for your sake, and to love you with his whole soul, and allow the priest to join your hands, that you may be man and wife, then you will never have an immortal soul. The first morning after he marries another, your heart will break. You will become foam on the crest of the waves. I will do it, said the little princess. But I must be paid also, said the witch. And it's not a trifle that I ask. You have the sweetest voice to any who dwell here in the depths of the sea. You believe that you will be able to charm the prince with it also. But this voice you must give to me, the best thing you possess. Will I have for the price of my draught? My own blood must be mixed with it, that it may be as sharp as a two-edged sword. But if you take away my voice, the little mermaid, what is left for me? Your beautiful form, your graceful walk, and your expressive eyes. Surely with these you can enchant a man's heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Put out your little tongue so I may cut it off, then you shall have your powerful draught. It shall be, said the little mermaid. Then the witch placed her cauldron on the fire to prepare the magic draught. Cleanliness is a good thing, she said, scouring the vessel with snakes which had been tied together in a large knot. Then she pricked herself in the breast and let the black blood drop into it. The steam that rose formed itself into such horrible shapes that no one could look at them without fear. Every moment the witch threw something else into the vessel, and when it began to boil, the sound was like the whooping of crocodiles that were in pain. When at last the magic draught was ready, it looked like the clearest water. There it is for you, said the witch. Then she cut off the mermaid's tongue, so that she became dumb and would never ever speak or sing again. If the polypi should seize hold of you as you return through the wood, said the witch, throw over a few drops of potion, and their fingers will be torn into 1,000 pieces. But the little mermaid did not need to do this, for the polypi sprang back in terror when they caught sight of the glittering draught, which shone in her hand like a twinkling star. She passed quickly through the wood and the marsh, and between the rushing whirlpools. She saw that in her father's palace the torches in the ballroom were extinguished. All were asleep within. But she did not venture to go into them, for now she was dumb and going to leave them forever. She felt as if her heart would break. She stole in the garden, took a few flowers from each flower bed of her sisters, kissed her hand 1,000 times towards the palace, then rose up through the dark blue waters, The sun had not risen when she came to the side of the prince's palace and approached the beautiful marble steps, but the moon shone clear and bright. There the little mermaid drank the magic draught, and it seemed as if a two-edged sword went through her delicate body. She fell into a swoon and lay like a dead person. When the sun arose and shone over the sea, she recovered and felt a sharp pain. But just before her stood the handsome young prince. He fixed his cold eyes upon her so earnestly that she cast down her own, and then became aware that her fish's tail was gone, and that she had a pretty pair of white legs and tiny feet, as any little mermaid could have, but she had no clothes. So she wrapped herself in a long, thick hair. The prince asked her who she was, where she came from, and she looked at him mildly and sorrowfully, with her deep blue eyes, for she could not speak. Every step she took was as the witch had said it would be. She felt as if treading upon the points of needles or sharp knives, but she bore it willingly, and stepped as lightly by the prince's side as a soap bubble, so that he and all who saw her wondered at her graceful swaying movements. She was very soon arrayed in costly robes of silk and muslin, was the most beautiful creature in the palace, but she was dumb, and could neither speak nor sing. Beautiful female slaves dressed in silk and gold stepped forward and sang before the prince and his royal parents. One sang better than the others, and the prince clapped his hands and smiled at her. This was a great sorrow to the little mermaid. She knew how much more sweetly she herself could sing once, and she thought, oh, if he could only know that I have given away my voice forever to be with him. The slave next performed some pretty fairy-like dances to the sound of beautiful music. Then the little mermaid raised her lovely white arms, stood on the tips of her toe and glided across the floor and danced as no one yet had been able to dance. At each moment her beauty became more and more revealed. Her expressive eyes appealed more directly to the heart than the songs of the slaves. Everyone was enchanted, especially the prince, who called her his little foundling, and she danced again quite readily to please him, though each time her foot touched the floor it seemed as if she trod on sharp knives. The prince said she should remain with him always, and she received permission to sleep at his door on a velvet cushion. He had a page's dress made for her, that she might accompany him on horseback. They rode together through the sweet-scented woods, where the green boughs touched their shoulders. The little birds sang among the fresh leaves. She climbed with the prince to the tops of the high mountains. Although her tender feet bled, so that even the steps were marked, she only laughed and followed him till they could see the clouds beneath them, looking like a flock of birds travelling to distant lands. While at the prince's palace, when all the household were asleep, she would go and sit on the broad marble steps, for it eased her burning feet to bathe them in the cold sea water. Then she thought of all those below in the deep. Once during the night, her sisters came up arm in arm, singing sorrowfully as they floated on the water. She beckoned to them, and they recognized her and told her how she had grieved them. After that, they came to the same place every night, and once she saw in the distance her old grandmother, who had not been to the surface of the sea for many years. The old sea king, her father, with his crown on his head. They stretched out their hands towards her, but they did not venture near the land, as her sisters did. As the days passed, she loved the prince more fondly, and he loved her. Or he would love a little child just the same, but it never came into his head to make her his wife. Unless he married her, she could not receive an immortal soul. So in the morning after his marriage with another, she would then dissolve into the form of the sea. Do you not love me the best of all? The eyes of the little mermaid seemed to say, when he took her in his arms, and kissed her forehead. Yes, you are dear to me, said the prince, for you have the best heart and the most devoted to me. You are like a young maiden whom I once saw, but whom I shall never meet again. I was on a ship that was wrecked, and the waves cast me ashore near a holy temple. Several young maidens performed the service. The youngest of them found me on shore and saved my life. I saw but twice. She's the only one in the world whom I could love. But you are like her, and you have almost driven her image out of my mind. She belongs to the Holy Temple, and my good fortune has been sent in the likeness of you instead of her, and we will never part. Ah, he knows not that it was I who saved his life, thought the little mermaid. I carried him over the sea to the wood where the temple stands. I sat beneath the form and watched till the human beings came to help him. I saw the pretty maiden that he loves better than he loves me, and the mermaid sighed deeply, but she could not shed tears. He says the maiden belongs to the holy temple, therefore she will never return to the world. They will meet no more. While I am by his side and see him every day, I will take care of him and love him and give up my life for his sake. Very soon it was said that the prince must marry, and that the beautiful daughter of the neighbouring king would be his wife, for a fine ship was being fitted out. Although the prince gave out that he merely intended to pay a visit to the king, it was generally supposed that he really went to see his daughter. A great company were to go with him. The little mermaid smiled and shook her head. She knew the prince's thoughts better than any of the others. I must travel, he said. I must see this beautiful princess. My parents desire it, but they will not oblige me to bring her home as my bride. I cannot love her. She is not like the beautiful maiden in the temple, whom you resemble. If I were forced to choose a bride, I would rather choose you, my dumb foundling, with those expressive eyes. Then he kissed her rosy mouth, played with her long waving hair, laid his hand on her heart while she dreamed of what could be, the happiness of the immortal soul. You're not afraid of the sea, my dumb child, he said. As they stood in the deck of the noble ship, we wished to carry them to the country of the neighbouring kingdom. And then he told her of storm and of calm and of strange fishes in the deep beneath them, and of what the divers had seen there. And she smiled at his descriptions, for she knew better than anyone what wonders were at the bottom of the sea. In the moonlight, when all on board were asleep, excepting the men at the helm, who were steering, she sat on deck, gazing down through the clear water. She thought she could distinguish her father's castle, and upon it her aged grandmother, with a silver crown on her head, looking through the rushing tide at the keel of the vessel. Then her sisters came up on the waves and gazed at her mournfully, wringing their white hands. She beckoned to them and smiled, and wanted to tell them how happy and well off she was, but the cabin boy approached, and when her sisters dived down, he thought it was merely the form of the sea which he saw. The next morning the ship sailed into the harbour of a beautiful town belonging to the king, whom the prince was going to visit. The church bells were ringing, and from the high tower sounded a flourish of trumpets and soldiers, with flying colours and glittering bayonets, lined the rocks through which they passed. Every day was a festival. Balls, entertainments followed one another. But the princess had not yet appeared. People said she was being brought up and educated in a religious house, where she was learning every royal virtue. At last she came. Then the little mermaid was very anxious to see whether she was really beautiful, was obliged to acknowledge that she had never seen a more perfect vision of beauty. Her skin was delicately fair. Beneath her long, dark lashes, her eyes seemed to be bright blue and laughing, and they shone with truth and purity. It was you, said the prince, who saved my life when I lay down on the beach. And he folded his blushing bride in his arms. Oh, I am too happy, said he to the little mermaid. My fondest hopes are all fulfilled. You will rejoice at my happiness, for your devotion to me is great and sincere. The little mermaid kissed his hand and felt as if her heart were already broken. His wedding morning would bring death to her. She would change into the form of the sea. All the church bells rung and the heralds rode about the town proclaiming the betrothal. Perfumed oil was burning in costly silver lamps on every altar. The priests waved the censers while the bride and bridegroom joined their hands and received the blessing of the bishop. The little mermaid, dressed in silk and gold, held up her bride's train, but her ears heard nothing of the festive music, and her eye saw not the holy ceremony. She thought of the night of death which was coming to her, and of all she had lost in the world. On the same evening, the bride and bridegroom went on board the ship. Cannons were roaring, flags waving, and in the centre of the ship a costly tent of purple and gold had been erected. It contained elegant couches for the reception of the bridal pair during the night. The ship, with swelling sails and a favourable wind, glided away smoothly and lightly over the calm sea. When it grew dark, a number of coloured lamps were lit, and the sailors danced merrily on the deck. The little mermaid could not help thinking of her first rising out of the sea, when she had seen familiar festivities and joys. She joined in the dance, poised herself in the air as a swallow, when he pursues his prey, and all present cheered her with wonder. She had never danced so elegantly before. Her tender feet felt as if they were cut by sharp knives, but she cared not for it. A sharper pang had pierced through her heart. She knew this was the last evening she would ever see the prince, for whom she had forsaken her kindred and her home, and given up a beautiful voice, and suffered of unheard pain daily for him, while he knew nothing of it. This was the last evening that she would breathe the same air with him, or gaze on the starry sky and the deep sea. An eternal night, without a thought or dream, awaited her. She had no soul, and now she could never win one. All was joy and gaiety on board ship, till long after midnight. She laughed and danced with the rest, while the thoughts of death were in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, while she played with his raven hair, till they went arm in arm to rest in the splendid tent. Then all became still on board the ship. The helmsman, alone awake, stood at the helm. The little mermaid leaned her white arms on the edge of the vessel and looked towards the east for the first blush of morning, for the first ray of dawn that would bring her death. She saw her sisters rising out of the flood. They were as pale as herself, but their long beautiful hair waved no more in the wind, and had been cut off. "We have given our heir to the witch," they said, "to obtain help for you, that you might not die tonight. She has given us a knife. Here it is. See, it is very sharp. Before the sun rises, you must plunge it into the heart of the prince. When the warm blood falls upon your feet, they will grow together again and form into a fish's tail, and you will be once more a mermaid, and return to us to live out your 300 years before you die and change into the salt and foam. Haste then, he or you must die before sunrise. Our old grandmother mourns so for you that her white hair is falling off from sorrow, as ours fell under the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back. Hasten. Do you not see the first red streaks in the sky? In a few minutes the sun will rise, and you will die." And then they sighed deeply and mournfully and sank down beneath the waves. The little mermaid drew back the crimson curtain of the tent and beheld the fair bride, with her head resting on the prince's breast. She bent down and kissed his fair brow, then looked at the sky on which the rosy dawn grew brighter and brighter. Then she glanced at the sharp knife, and again fixed her eyes on the prince, who whispered the name of his bride in his dreams. She was in his thoughts, and the knife trembled in the hand of the little mermaid. Then she flung it far away from her into the waves. The water turned red where it fell, and the drops that spurted upon looked like blood. She cast one more lingering, half-fainting glance at the prince, and then threw herself from the ship into the sea, and thought her body was dissolving into foam. The sun rose above the waves, and its warm rays fell on the cold form of the little mermaid, who did not feel as if she were dying. She saw the bright sun all around her, floated hundreds of transparent, beautiful beings. She could see through them, the white sails of the ship and the red clouds in the sky. Their speech was melodious, but too ethereal to be heard by mortal ears, and they were also unseen by mortal eyes. The little mermaid perceived that she had a body like theirs, and that she continued to rise higher and higher out of the foam. "Where am I?" asked she, and a voice sounded ethereal, as the voice of those who were with her. No earthly music could imitate it. "Amongst the daughters of the air," answered one of them. "A mermaid has not an immortal soul, nor can she obtain one unless she wins the love of a human being. On the power of another hangs her eternal destiny. but the daughters of the air, although they do not possess an immortal soul, can, by their good deeds, procure one for themselves. We fly to warm countries and cool the sultry air that destroys mankind with a pestilence. We carry the perfume of the flowers to spread health and restoration. After we have striven for 300 years to all the good in our power, we receive an immortal soul and take part in the happiness of mankind. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with all your heart to do as we are doing, and you have suffered and endured and raised yourself to the spirit world by your good deeds. And now, by striving for 300 years in the same way, you may obtain an immortal soul. The little mermaid lifted her glorified eyes towards the sun and felt them for the first time, filling with tears. On the ship in which she had left, there were life and noise. She saw him and his beautiful bride searching for her. Sorrowfully they gazed at the pearly form as if they knew she had thrown herself into the waves. Unseen, she kissed the forehead of the bride and fanned the prince, and then mounted with the other children of the air to rosy cloud and floated through the ether. After 300 years, thus shall we float into the kingdom of heaven, said she, and we may even get there sooner, whispered one of her companions. Unseen, we can enter the house of men, where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child, who is the joy of his parents and deserves their love, our time of probation is shortened. The child does not know that we fly through the room, that we smile with joy at his good conduct, for we can count 1 year less of our 300 years. But when we see a naughty or wicked child, we shed tears of sorrow, and for every tear, a day is added to our time of trial. The end. And that is the original Little Mermaid, not how Disney redid it. The Little Mermaid did die, but not in the same way as you might think, for she had given a lot to help mankind, to be with mankind. She'd done a lot for the prince, so that's why she became what is known as, I guess, an ethereal fairy, an air spirit. From that, she could obtain a mortal soul. And that is the traditional Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello and welcome back to my channel. If you are listening on YouTube, you will get each story individually. If you are listening on my podcast, you will be able to just play the stories that are not yet available on YouTube, but are on the podcast because they are fluent. They go straight into the next episode. So I just wanted to highlight that, of course. So that's why on the podcast you might hear me say, welcome to my channel a few times, because on YouTube they are separate, but on my podcast I create a few so that you can listen to them continuous. Anyway, another Hans fairy tale. A leaf from heaven. High up in the clear, pure air flew an angel, with a flower plucked from the garden of heaven. As he was kissing the flower, a very little leaf fell from it and sunk down into the soft earth in the middle of a wood. It immediately took root, sprouted, and sent out shoots among the other plants. What a ridiculous little shoot, said one. No one will recognize it, not even the thistle nor the stinging nettle. It must be a kind of garden plant, said another. And so they sneered and despised the plant as a thing from a garden. Where are you coming, said the tall thistles, whose leaves were all armed with thorns. It is stupid nonsense to allow yourself to shoot out in that way. We are not here to support you. Winter came and the plant was covered with snow, but the snow glittered over it, as if it had sunshine beneath as well as above. When spring came, the plant appeared in full bloom, a more beautiful object than any other plant in the forest. And now the professor of botany presented himself, one who could explain his knowledge in black and white. He examined and tested the plant, but it did not belong to his system of botany. Nor could he possibly find out what class it did belong. It must be some degenerate species, said he. I do not know it, and it's not mentioned in any system. Not known in any system, repeated the thistles and the nettles. The large trees which grew around it saw the plant and heard the remarks, but they said not a word, neither good nor bad, which is the wisest plan for those who are ignorant. There passed through the forest a poor innocent girl. Her heart was pure and her understanding increased by her faith. Her chief inheritance had been an old Bible, which she read and valued. From its pages she heard the voice of God speaking to her and telling her to remember what was said of Joseph's brethren when persons wished to injure her. They imagined evil in their hearts, but God turned it to good. If we suffer wrongfully, if we are misunderstood or despised, we must think of him who was pure and holy, and who prayed for those who nailed him to the cross. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The girl stood still before the wonderful plant, for the green leaves exhaled a sweet and refreshing fragrance, and the flowers glittered and sparkled in the sunshine like coloured flames, and the harmony of sweet sounds lingered around them as if some were concealed inside the deepness and melody which thousands of years could not exhaust. With pious gratitude the girl looked up upon this glorious work of God, and bent down over one of the branches that she might examine the flower and inhale the sweet perfume. Then a light broke in her mind, and her heart expanded. Gladly would she have plucked a flower, but she could not overcome a reluctance to break one off. She knew it would so soon fade. So she took only a single green leaf, carried it home, and laid it in a Bible, where it remained evergreen, fresh and unfading. Between the pages of the Bible it still lay when, a few weeks afterwards, the Bible was laid under the young girl's head in her coffin. A holy calm rested on her face, as if the earthly remains bore the impress of the truth that she now stood in the presence of God. In the forest the wonderful plant still continued to bloom, till it grew and became almost a tree, and all the birds of passage bowed themselves before it. The plant is a foreigner, no doubt, said the thistles and burdocks. We can never conduct ourselves like that in this country. And the black forest snails actually spat at the flower. Then came the swineherd. He was collecting thistles and shrubs to burn them from the ashes. He pulled up the wonderful plant, roots and all, and placed it in his bundle. This will be useful as any, he said. So the plant was carried away. Not long after, the king of the country suffered from the deepest melancholy. He was diligent and industrious, but employment did him no good. They read deep and learned books to him, and then the lightest and most trifling that could ever be found, but all to no purpose. Then they applied for advice to one of the wise men of the world, and he sent them a message to say there was a remedy which would relieve and cure him, and that it was a plant of heavenly origin which grew in the forest in the king's own dominions. The messenger described the flower so that its appearance would not be mistaken. Then, said the swineherd, I am afraid I carried this plant away from the forest in my bundle, and it has been burned along. Now it is ashes. But I did not know any better. You did not know any better. Ignorance upon ignorance indeed. The poor swineherd took these words to heart, for they were addressed to him. He knew not that there were others who were equally ignorant. Not even a leaf of the plant could be found. There was one, but it lay in the coffin of the dead. No one knew anything about it. Then the king, in his melancholy, wandered out to a spot in the wood. Here is where the plant stood, he said. It is a sacred place. Then he ordered that the place should be surrounded with a golden railing and a sentry stationed near it. The botanical professor wrote a long treatise about the heavenly plant, and for this he was loaded with gold, which improved the position of himself and his family. And this part is really the most pleasant part of the story, for the plant had disappeared. The king remained as melancholy and sad as ever, but the sentry said he had always been so. He was never any different anyway. The end. And that is another fairy tale from Hans Christian Andersen, a classic fairy tale teller. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm the fairy tale of Hans Christian Andersen. If you're on YouTube, they get delivered in episodes. If you're on the podcast, always come back and check because it's a fluent playlist. Therefore, I add to it all the time. So it's best to always come back and check to make sure that there's no new episodes. This is called The Loveliest Rose in the World. There lived once a great queen, in whose garden were found at all the seasons the most splendid flowers, and from every land in the world. She especially loved roses, and therefore she possessed the most beautiful varieties of this flower, from the wild hedge rose, with its apple-scented leaves, to the splendid Provence rose. They grew near the shelter of the walls, wound themselves round columns and window frames, crept along passages and over the ceilings of the halls. They were of every fragrance and colour, but care and sorrow dwelt within these halls. The queen lay upon a sick bed, and the doctors declared she must die. There is still one thing that could save her, said one of the wisest among them. Bring her the loveliest rose in the world, on which exhibits the purest and brightest love. And if it is brought to her before her eyes close, then she will not die. Then from all parts came those who brought roses that bloomed in every garden, but they were not the right sort. The flower must be one from the garden of love. But which of the roses there showed forth the highest and purest love? The poet sang of this rose, the loveliest in the world, and each named one which he considered worthy of that title, and intelligence of what was required was sent far and wide to every heart that beat with love, to every class, age, and condition. No one has yet named the flower, said the wise man. No one has pointed out the spot where it blooms in all its splendour. It is not a rose from the coffin of Romeo and Juliet, or from the grave of Walberg, though these roses will live in everlasting song. It is not one of the roses which sprouted forth from the blood-stained fame of Winkelried, the blood which flows from the breast of a hero who dies, for his country is sacred, and his memory is sweet, and no rose can be redder than the blood which flows from his veins. Neither is it the magic flower of science, to obtain which wondrous flower a man devotes many an hour of his fresh young life in sleepless nights in a lonely chamber. I know where it blooms, said a happy mother, who came with a lovely child beside the queen. I know where the loveliest rose in the world is. It is seen on the blooming cheeks of my sweet child, when it expresses the pure and holy love of infancy. When refreshed by sleep, it opens its eyes and smiles upon me with childlike affection. This is a lovely rose, said the wise man, but there is one still more lovely. Yes, one far more lovely, said one of the women. I have seen it, and a lofty and pure rose does not bloom, but it was white, like the leaves of a bluish rose. I saw it on the cheeks of the queen. She had taken off her golden crown, and through the long, dreary night she carried her sick child in her arms. She wept over it, kissed it, and prayed for it, and only a mother can pray in that hour of her anguish. Holy and wonderful in its might is the white rose of grief, but it is not the one we seek. No, the loveliest rose is in the world I saw at the Lord's table, said the good old bishop. I saw it shine as if an angel's face had appeared. A young maiden knelt at the altar and renewed her vows and made at her baptism. And there were white roses and red roses on the blushing cheeks of that special young girl. She looked up to heaven with all the purity and love of her young spirit. In all the expressions of the highest and purest love. May she be blessed, said the wise man, but no one has yet named the loveliest rose in the world. Then there came into her room a child, the queen's little son. Tears stood in his eyes and glistened on his cheeks. He carried a great book, and the binding was of velvet with silver clasps. Mother, cried the little boy, only hear what I have read. And the child seated himself by the bedside and read from the book of him who suffered death on the cross to save all men, even who are yet unborn. He read, Greater love hath no man than this. And as he read, a roseate hue spread over the cheeks of the queen, and her eyes became so enlightened and clear that she saw from the leaves of the book a lovely rose spring forth, a type of him who shed his blood on the cross. I see it, she said. He who beholds this, the loveliest rose on earth, shall never die. The end. And that's the tale of the loveliest rose. And as always, there's a bigger lesson to that from Hans Christian Andersen, who's very good at that. So if you know what the lesson is, do leave a comment and let me know. I am very, very curious, and I love reading them and finding out what you think. Many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Wysteria Energy Twister here. This is another Hans Christian Andersen called The Jumper. The flea, the grasshopper, and the skipjack once wanted to see which of them could jump highest. They invited the whole world, and whoever else would come, to see the grand sight. And there the three famous jumpers were met together in the room. Yes, I'll give my daughter to him who jumps highest, said the king, for it would be mean to let these people jump for nothing. The flea stepped out first. He had very pretty manners and bowed in all directions, for he had young ladies' blood in his veins and was accustomed to consort only with human beings, and that was of great consequence. Then came the grasshopper. He was certainly much heavier, but he had a good figure, and wore the green uniform that was born with him. This person, moreover, maintained that he belonged to the very old family in the land of Egypt, and that he was highly esteemed there. He had just come from the field, he said, and had been put into a card house 3 stories high, and all made of picture cards with the figures turned inwards. There were doors and windows in the house, cut in the body of the Queen of Hearts. I think so, he said, that 16 native crickets who have chirped from their youth up, and have never yet had a card house of their own, would become thinner than they are with envy if they were to hear me. Both of them, the flea and the grasshopper, took care to announce who they were, and that they consider themselves entitled to marry a princess. The skipjack said nothing, but it was said of him that he thought all the more And directly the yard dog had smelt at him. He was ready to assert that the skipjack was of good family and formed from the breastbone of an undoubted goose. The old councillor, who had received 3 medals for holding his tongue, declared that the skipjack possessed the gift of prophecy. One could tell by his bones whether there would be a severe winter or a mild one, and that's more than one can always tell from the breastbone of the man who writes the almanac. I shall not say anything more, said the old king. I only go on quietly, and always think the best. Now, they were to take their jump. The flea sprang so high that no one could even see him, and they asserted that he had not jumped at all. That was very mean. The grasshopper only sprang half as high, but he sprang straight into the king's face, and the king declared that was very horribly rude. The skipjack stood a long time considering. At last, people thought that he could not jump at all. I only hope he's not become unwell, said the yard dog, and then he smelt at him again. Tap! He sprang with a little crooked jump just into the lap of the princess, who sat on the low golden stool. Then the king said, the highest leap was taken by him who jumped up to my daughter, for therein lies the point, but it requires head to achieve that, and the skipjack has shown that he has a head. And so he had the princess. I jumped highest after all, said the flea, but it's all the same. Let her have the goose bone with its lump of wax and bit of steak. I jumped to the highest. But in this world a body is required if one wishes to be seen. And the flea went into foreign military service, where he said that he was possibly killed. The grasshopper seated himself out in the ditch, and thought and considered how things happened in the world. And he too said, body is required. Body is required. Then he sang his own melancholy song, and from that we have gathered this story, which they say is not true, though it's now written in print. The end. And that is the end of the jumper, obviously. There's a good lesson in that, and I'm curious to see what you think the lesson is, because I love reading your comments and how you believe the lesson plays out in real life. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. If you hear a doggy in the distance snoring away, that's just my Dougal pie. So this is an interesting tale. It begins with What the Moon Saw introduction. However, it does continue on for some time, so maybe I will do it in parts. I'm not sure yet. We will see how we go. What the Moon Saw. It is a strange thing. When I feel most fervently and most deeply, my hands and my tongue seem alike tied, so that I cannot rightly describe or accurately portray the thoughts that are rising within me. And yet I am a painter. My eyes tell me as much as that, and all my friends who have seen my sketches and fancies say the name. I am a poor lad, and live in one of the narrowest of lanes, but I do not want for light, as my room is high up in the house, with an extensive prospect over the neighbouring roofs. During the first few days, I went to live in the town. I felt low-spirited and solitary enough, instead of the forest and the green hills of the former days. I had here only a forecast of chimney pots to look out upon, and then I had not a single friend, not one familiar face greeted me. So one evening I sat at the window in a desponding mood, and presently I opened the casement and looked out. Oh, how my heart leaped up with joy! Here was a well-known face at last, a round, friendly countenance, the face of a good friend I had known at home. In fact, it was the moon. It looked upon me. It did. He was quite unchanged, the dear old moon, and had the same face exactly that he used to show when he peered down upon me through the willow trees on the moor. I kissed my hand to him over and over again as he shone far into my little room, and he, for his part, promised me that every evening when he came abroad he would look in upon me for a few moments. This promise he has kept, faithfully kept. It is a pity that he can only stay such a short time when he comes. Whenever he appears, he tells me of one thing or another that he has seen on the previous night, or that same evening. Just paint the scenes I described to you. This is what he said to me, and you will have a very pretty picture book. I followed his injunction for many meetings and evenings. I could make up a new 1001 nights in my own way out of these pictures, but the number might be too great. After all, the pictures I have here given have not been chosen at random, but following their proper order, just as they were described to me. Some great gifted painter or some poet or musician may make something more of them if he likes. What I have given here are only hasty sketches, hurriedly put upon the paper, with some of my own thoughts interspread. For the moon did not come to me every evening. A cloud sometimes hid his face from me. First evening. Last night. I'm quoting the moon's own words here. Last night I was gliding through the cloudless Indian sky. My face was mirrored in the waters of the Ganges. My beams strove to pierce through the thick, intertwining boughs of the banana arching beneath me like the tortoise shell. Forth from the thicket tripped a Hindu maid, light as a gazelle, beautiful as Eve, airy and ethereal as a vision, and yet sharply defined amid the surrounding shadows. Stood this daughter of Hindustan. I could read on her delicate brow the thought that had brought her hither. The thorny creeping plants tore her sandals, but for all that she came rapidly forward. The deer that had come down to the river to quench her thirst sprang by with a startled bound. For in her hand the maiden bore a lighted lamp. I could see the blood in her delicate fingertips as she spread them from a screen before the dancing flame. She came down to the stream, set the lamp upon the water, and let it float away. The flame flickered to and fro and seemed ready to expire, but still the lamp burned on, and the girl's black sparkling eyes, half-veiled behind her long silken lashes, followed it with a gaze of earnest intensity. She knew that if the lamp continued to burn so long as she could keep it in the night, her betrothed was still alive. But if the lamp was suddenly extinguished, he was dead. And the lamp burned bravely on, and she fell on her knees and prayed. Near her in the grass lay a speckled snake, but she heeded it not. She only thought of Brahma and of her betrothed. He lives, she shouted joyfully. He lives. And from the mountains the echo came back upon her. He lives. Second evening. Yesterday, said the moon to me, I looked down upon a small courtyard surrounded on all sides by houses. In the courtyard sat a clucking hen with 11 chickens, and a pretty little girl was running and jumping around them. The hen was frightened and screamed and spread out her wings over the little brood. Then the girl's father came out and scolded her, and I glided away and thought no more of that matter. But this evening, only a few minutes ago, I looked down into the same courtyard. Everything was quiet, but presently the little girl came forth again, crept quietly to the hen house, pushed back the bolt, and slipped into the apartment of the hen and chickens. They cried out loudly and came fluttering down from their perches, and they ran about in dismay. The little girl ran after them. I saw it quite plainly, for I looked through a hole in the henhouse wall. I was angry with the woeful child, and felt glad when her father came out and scolded her more violently than yesterday. Holding her roughly by the arm, she held down her head, and her blue eyes were full of large tears. "What are you about here?" he asked. She wept and said, "I wanted to kiss the hen and beg her pardon for frightening her yesterday, but I was afraid to tell you." And the father kissed the innocent child's forehead, and I kissed her on the mouth and eyes. Third evening. In the narrow street round the corner yonder. It is so narrow that my beams can only glide for a minute along the walls of the house. But in that minute, I do see enough to learn what the world is made of in that narrow street. I saw a woman. 16 years ago, that woman was a child, playing in the garden of the old parsonage in the country. The hedges of a rose bush were old, and the flowers were faded. They straggled wild over the paths, and the ragged branches grew up among the boughs of the apple trees. Here and there were a few roses still in bloom, not so fair as the queen of flowers generally appears, but still, they had a colouring scent too. The clergyman's little daughter appeared to me a far lovelier rose, as she sat on her stool under the straggling hedge, hugging and caressing her doll with the battered pasteboard cheeks. 10 years afterwards, I saw her again. I beheld her in splendid ballroom. She was a beautiful bride of a rich merchant. I rejoiced at her happiness, and sought her on calm, quiet evenings. Ah, nobody thinks of my clear eye, and my silent glance. Alas, my rose ran wild, like the rose bushes in the garden of the parsonage. There are tragedies in everyday life, and tonight I saw the last act of one. She was lying in bed in a house in that narrow street. She was sick unto death, and the cruel landlord came up and tore away the thin coverlet, her only protection against the cold. "Get up," he said. "Your face is enough to frighten one. Get up and dress yourself. Give me money, or I'll turn you out into the street." "Quick, get up," she answered. Alas, death is gnawing at my heart. Let me rest. But he forced her to get up, and bathe her face, and put a wreath of roses in her hair. And he placed her in a chair at the window, with a candle burning beside her, and went away. I looked at her, and she was sitting motionless, with her hands in her lap. The wind caught the open window and shut it with a crash. So that her pain came cluttering down into fragments, but still she never moved. The curtain caught fire, and the flames played about her face, and I saw that she was dead. There at the open window sat the dead woman, preaching a sermon against sin, my poor faded rose, out of the parsonage garden. And those are the first 3 evenings of What the Moon Did See. When we come back, we shall move on to the 4th evening of What the Moon Did See. Remember, there's lessons in those, and I'd love to know what you think those lessons are. Many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. We are on What the Moon Saw, and we are on the 4th evening. This evening I saw a German play acted to the moon. It was in a little town. A stable had been turned into a theatre, that is to say, The stable had been left standing and had been turned into private boxes, and all the timber work had been covered with coloured paper. A little iron chandelier hung beneath the ceiling, and that it might be made to disappear into the ceiling, as it does in great theatres, when the ting-ting of the prompter's bell is heard. A great inverted tub had been placed just above it. Ting-ting, and the little iron chandelier suddenly rose at least half a yard and disappeared into the tub. And that was a sign that the play was going to begin. A young nobleman and his lady, who happened to be passing through the little town, were present at the performance, and consequently the house was crowded. But under the chandelier was a vacant space like a little crater. Not a single soul sat there, for the tallow was dropping, drip, drip. I saw everything, for it was so warm in there that every loophole had been opened. The male and female servants stood outside, peeping through the chinks, although a real policeman was inside, threatening them with a stick. Close by the orchestra could be seen the noble young couple in two old armchairs, which are usually occupied by his worship with, the mayor and lady at his side. But, no, these latter, today obliged to content themselves with wooden forms, just as if they'd been ordinary citizens. And the lady observed quietly to herself, "One sees now that there is a rank above rank," and this incident gave an air of extra festivity to the whole proceedings. The chandelier gave little leaps, the crowd got their knuckles rapped, and I, the moon, was present at the performance from the beginning to the end. The fifth evening. Yesterday, began the moon, I looked down upon the turmoil of Paris. My eye penetrated into an apartment of the Louvre, an old grandmother, poorly clad. She belonged to the working class, was following one of the underservants into the great empty throne room, for this was the apartment she wanted to see, that she was resolved to see. It had cost her a many little sacrifice, and many a coaxing word to penetrate thus far. She folded her thin hands and looked around with an air of reverence, as if she had been in church. Here it was, she said, here, and she approached the throne, from which hung the rich velvet fringed with gold lace. There, she exclaimed, there, and she knelt and kissed the purple carpet. I think she was actually weeping. But it was not this very velvet, observed the footman, and a smile played about his mouth. True, but it was this very place, replied the woman, and it must have looked just like this. It looked so, and yet it did not, observed the man. The windows were beaten in, and the doors were off their hinges. There was blood upon the floor. But for all that you can say, my grandson died upon the throne of France. Died, mournfully repeated the old woman. I do not think another word was spoken, and they soon quitted the hall. The evening twilight faded, and my light shone, doubly vivid, above the rich velvet that covered the throne of France. Now, who do you think this poor woman was? Listen, I will tell you a story. It happened in the Revolution of July, on the evening of the most brilliant victorious day, when every house was a fortress, every window a breastwork. The people stormed the Tuileries. Even women and children were to be found among the combatants. They penetrated into the apartments and halls of palace. A poor half-grown boy in ragged blouse fought among the older insurgents. Mortally wounded with several bayonet thrusts, he sank down. This happened in the throne room. They laid the bleeding youth upon the throne of France, wrapped the velvet around his wounds, and his blood steamed forth upon the imperial purple. There was a picture, the splendid hall, the fighting groups, a torn flag upon the ground, the tricolours waving above the bayonets, and on the throne lay the poor lad, with the pale, glorified countenance, his eyes turned upwards towards the sky, his limbs writhing in the death agony, his breast bare, and his poor tattered clothing half hidden by the rich velvet, embroidered with silver lilies. At the boy's cradle a prophecy had been spoken. He will die on the throne of France. The mother's heart dreamt of a second Napoleon. My beams have kissed the wreath of immortelles on his grave, and this night they kiss the forehead of the old grande dame, while in a dream the picture floated before her with "Thou mayest draw the poor boy on the throne of France." The sixth evening. "I've been up, Salah," said the moon. I looked down upon the great plain covered with coarse grass, and upon the barren fields. I mirrored my face in the Tiris river, while the steamboat drove the fish into the rushes. Beneath me floated the waves, throwing long shadows on the so-called graves of Odin, Thor, and Freya. In the scanty turf that covers the hillside, names have been cut. There is no monument here, no memorial on which the traveller can have his name carved, no rocky wall on whose surface he can get it painted. So visitors have the turf cut away for that purpose. The naked earth peers through in the form of great letters and names. These form a network over the whole hill. Here is an immortality which lasts till the fresh turf grows. Up on the hill stood a man, a poet. He emptied the mead horn with the broad silver rim, and he murmured a name. He begged the winds not to betray him, but I heard the name, I knew it. A count's coronet sparkles above it, and therefore he did not speak it out. I smiled, for I knew that a poet's crown adorns his own name. The nobility of Eleanor d'Este is attached to the name of Tasso, and I also know where the rose of beauty blooms. Thus spake the moon, and a cloud came between us. May no cloud separate the poet from his rose. Seventh evening. Along the margin of the shore stretches a forest of firs and beeches, and fresh and fragrant is his wood. Hundreds of nightingales visit every spring. It's very, very sweet to smell. Close behind it is the sea, the ever-changing sea, and between the two is placed the broad high road. One carriage after another. Yes, one carriage after another rolls over it, but I did not follow them, for my eye loves best to rest upon one point. A Hun's grave lies there, and the sloe and blackthorn grow luxuriantly among the stones. Here is true poetry in nature. And how do you think men appreciate this poetry? I will tell you what I heard there last evening and during the night. First, two rich men landed. Proprietors come driving by. Those are glorious trees, said the first. Certainly, there are 10 loads of firewood in each, observed the other. It will be a hard winter. And last year, we got $14 a load. And they were gone. The road here is wretched, observed another man who drove past. That's the fault of those horrible trees, replied his neighbour. There's no free current of air. The wind can only come from the sea. And they were gone. The stagecoach went rattling past. All the passengers were asleep at this beautiful spot. The postilion blew his horn, but he only thought, I can play capitally. It sounds well here. I wonder if those in there like it. And the stagecoach vanished. Then two young fellows came galloping on a horseback. There's youth and spirit in the blood here, thought I, and indeed, they looked with a smile at the moss-green hill and the thick forest. I should not dislike a walk here with the miller's Christine, said one, and they flew past. The flowers scented the air. Every breath of air was hushed. It seemed as if the sea were a part of the sky that stretched above the deep valley. A carriage rolled by. 6 people were sitting in it. 4 of them were asleep. The 5th was thinking of his new summer coat, which would suit him admirably. The 6th turned to the coachman and asked him there were anything remarkable connected with yonder heap of stones. No, replied the coachman. It's only a heap of stones, but the trees are remarkable. How so? Why, I'll tell you how they are very remarkable. You see, in winter, when the snow lies very deep and was hidden the whole road, so nothing can be seen, those trees serve me for a landmark. I steer by them, so as not to drive into the sea, and you see that is why trees are remarkable. Now came a painter. He spoke not a word, but his eyes sparkled. He began to whistle. At this the nightingales sang louder than ever. Hold your tongues, he cried, hastily and testily, and he made accurate notes of all the colours and transitions, blue and lilac and dark brown. That will make a beautiful picture, he said. He took it in just as a mirror takes in a view, and as he worked he whistled the march of Rossini. And last of all came a poor girl. She laid aside the burden she carried, sat down to rest upon the Hun's grave. Her pale, handsome face was bent in a listening attitude towards the forest. Her eyes brightened. She gazed earnestly at the sea and the sky. Her hands were folded, and I think she prayed, Our Father. She herself could not understand the feeling that swept through her. But I know that this minute, and the beautiful, natural scene will live within her memory for years, for more vividly and more truly than the painter could portray it with his colours as paper could. My rays followed her till the morning dawn, eventually kissed her beautiful brow. And that leads us up to the 7th evening of the moon. When we return, we will go to the 8th evening of the moon. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Fairy Tales of Hans Christian Andersen. We are continuing with What the Moon Saw. The 8th evening. Heavy clouds obscured the sky, and the moon did not make its appearance at all. I stood in my little room, more lonely than ever, and looked up at the sky where he ought to have shown himself. My thoughts flew far away, up to my great friend, who every evening told me such pretty tales and showed me pictures. Yes, he has had an experience indeed. He glided over the waters of the deluge and smiled on Noah's Ark just as he lately glanced down upon me, and brought comfort and promise of new world that was to spring forth from the old. When the children of Israel sat weeping by the waters of Babylon, he glanced mournfully upon the willows, where hung the silent harps. When Romeo climbed the balcony, and the promise of true love floated like a cherub toward heaven, the round moon hung half hidden among the dark cypresses in the lucid air. He saw the captive giant of Saint Helena, looking from the lonely rock across the wide ocean, while great thoughts swept through his soul. Ah, what tales the moon can tell! Human life is like a story to him. Tonight I shall not see thee again, old friend. Tonight I can draw a picture of the memories of thy visit. And as I looked dreamily towards the clouds, the sky became bright. There was a glancing light, and a beam from the moon fell upon me. It vanished again, and dark clouds flew past. But still it was a greeting, a friendly good night offered to me by the moon. The 9th evening. The air was clear again. Several evenings had passed, and the moon was in the first quarter. Again he gave me an outline for a sketch. Listen to what he told me. I have followed the polar bird and the swimming whale in the eastern coast of Greenland. Gaunt ice-covered rocks and dark clouds hung over a valley, where dwarf willows and barberry bushes stood clothed in green. The blooming lichness exhaled sweet odours. My light was faint, my face pale as the water lily, that, torn from its stem, had been drifting for weeks with the tide. The crown-shaped northern light burned fiercely in the sky. Its ring was broad, and from its circumference the rays shot like whirling shafts of fire across the whole sky, flashing in changing radiance from green to red. The inhabitants of that icy region were assembling for dance and festivity, but, accustomed to this glorious spectacle, they scarcely deigned to glance at it. Let us have the soul of the dead to their ball play with the heads of the walruses. They thought in their superstition, and they turned their whole attention to song and dance. In the midst of the circle, and, divested of his furry cloak, stood a Greenlander, with a small pipe. He played and sang a song about catching the seal, and the chorus around chimed with, aye, aye, ha. And in the white furs they danced about in a circle, till you might fancy it was a polar bear's ball. And now a court of judgment was opened. Those Greenlanders who had quarrelled stepped forward, and the offended person chanted forth the faults of his adversary in an extempore song, turning them sharply into ridicule, to the sound of the pipe and the measure of the dance. The defendant replied with a satire as keen, while the audience laughed and gave their verdict. The rocks heaved, the glaciers melted, and great masses of ice and snow came crashing down, shivering to fragments as they fall. It was a glorious Greenland summer night. 100 paces away, under the open tent of hides, lay a sick man. Life still flowed through his warmth. He himself felt it, and all who stood round him knew it also. Therefore his wife was already sewing round him the shroud of furs, that she might not afterwards be obliged to touch the dead body. And she asked, "Wilt thou be buried on the rock, in the firm snow? I will deck the spot with thy kayak and thy arrows, and the Ange cook shall dance over it. Or wouldst thou rather be buried in the sea?" "In the sea," he whispered, and nodded with a mournful smile. "Yes, it is a pleasant summer tent, the sea. Thousands of seals sport there. The walrus shall lie at thy feet, and the hunt will be safe and merry, and yelling children tore the outspread hide from the window hole, that the dead man might be carried to the ocean, the billowy ocean, that had given him food in life, and that now, in death, was to afford him a place of rest for his monument. He had the floating, ever-changing icebergs, whereupon the seal sleeps, while the storm-birds fly around their gleaming summits. The 10th evening. "I know an old maid," said the moon. "Every winter she wore a wrapper of yellow satin. It always remained new, and was the only fashion she followed. In summer she always wore the same straw hat, and I verily believe the very same grey-blue dress. She never went out, except across the street to an old female friend, and in later years she did not even take this walk, for the old friend was dead. In her solitude, my old maid was always busy at the window, which was adorned in summer with pretty flowers, and in winter with cress grown upon felt. During the last months I saw her no more at the window, but she was still alive, I know that, for I had not yet seen her begin the long journey of which she often spoke with her friend. Yes, she was in the habit of saying, 'When I come to die, I shall take a longer journey than I have ever made my whole life long. Our family vault is 6 miles from here. I shall be carried there, and shall sleep there among my family and relatives.' Last night, a van stopped at the house. A coffin was carried out, and then I knew she was dead. The placed straw round the coffin, and the van drove away. There slept the quiet old lady, who had not gone out of her house once for the last year. The van rolled through the town gate as briskly as if it were going for a pleasant excursion. On the high road the pace was quicker yet. The coachman looked nervously round, every now and then. I fancy he half expected to see her sitting on the coffin, in a yellow satin wrapper. And, because he was startled, he foolishly lashed his horses, while he held the reins so tightly that the poor beasts were in a foam. They were young and fiery. A hare jumped across the road and startled them, and they fairly ran away. The old, sober maiden, who had for years and years moved quietly round and round in a dull circle, was now in death, rattled and stock and stone on the public highway. The coffin in its covering of straw tumbled out of the van and was left on the high road, while horses, coachman and carriage flew past in wild career. The lark rose up, carolling from the field, twittering her morning lay over the coffin, and presently perched upon it, picking with her beak at the straw covering, as though she would tear it up. The lark rose up again, singing gaily, and I withdrew behind the red morning clouds. 11th night, or evening. I will give you a picture of Pompeii, said the moon. I was in the suburb, in the street of the tombs, as they call it, where the fair monuments stand in the spot, where ages ago the merry youths of their temples, bound with rosy wreaths, danced with the fair sisters of lace. Now the stillness of death resigned around. German mercenaries in the Napoleonic service kept guard, playing cards and diced, and a troop of strangers from beyond the mountains came into the town, accompanied by a sentry. They wanted to see the city that had risen from the grave, illumined by my beams, and I showed them the wheel ruts in the streets paved with broad lava slabs. I showed them the names on the doors, the signs that hung there yet. They saw in the little courtyard the basins of the fountains ornamented with shells, but no jet of water gushed upwards. No song sounded forth from the richly painted chambers, where the bronze dog kept the door. It was the city of the dead. Only Vesuvius thundered forth his everlasting hymn, each separate verse of which is called by men an eruption. We went to the temple of Venus, built of snow-white marble, with its high altar in front of the broad steps, and the weeping willows sprouting freshly forth among the pillars. The air was transparent and blue, and black. Vesuvius formed the background, with fire ever shooting forth from it, like the stem of the pine tree. Above it stretched a smoky cloud in the silence of the night, like the crown of the pine, but in a blood-red illumination. Along the company was a lady singer, a real and great singer. I have witnessed the homage paid to her in the greatest cities of Europe. When they came to the tragic theatre, they all sat down on the amphitheatre steps, and thus a small part of the house was occupied by an audience, as it had been many centuries ago. The stage still stood unchanged, with its walled side sceneries, the two arches in the background, through which the beholders saw the same scene that had been exhibited in the old times, a scene painted by nature herself, namely, the mountains between Sorrento and Amalfi. The singer gaily mounted the ancient stage and sang. The place inspired her, and she reminded me of a wild Arab horse that rushes headlong on with its snorting nostrils and flying mane. Her song was so light and yet so firm. Anon I thought of the mourning mother beneath the cross at Golgotha. So deep was the expression of pain, and, just as it had done thousands of years ago, the sound of applause and delight now filled the theatre. Happy, gifted creature, all the hearers exclaimed. 5 minutes more, and the stage was empty. The company had vanished, and not a sound more was heard. All were gone, but the ruins stood unchanged, as they will stand when centuries shall have gone by. And when none shall know of the momentary applause and of the triumph of the fair songstress, when all will be forgotten and gone, and even for me, this hour will be but a dream of the past. And that's the next section of What the Moon Saw. And we shall continue when we come back with the 12th evening. Remember, there's lessons to be had in these stories, so it would be nice to know what you think. If you're on YouTube, you will be waiting for the next episode. But if you're listening from the podcast, then don't worry. It will be a continuous episode after episode, so you'll be able to listen from start to finish. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister. Wysteria. Energy. Twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Fairytales of Hans Christian Andersen. This is still What the Moon Saw. We are on the 12th evening. I looked through the windows of an editor's house, said the moon. It was somewhere in Germany. I saw handsome furniture, many books, and a chaos of newspapers. Several young men were present. The editor himself stood at his desk, and two little books, both by young authors, were to be noticed. This one has been sent to me, said he. I've not read it yet. What think you of the contents? Oh, said the person addressed. He was a poet himself. It is good enough, a little broad, certainly, but you see the author is still young. The verses might be better. To be sure, the thoughts are sound, though there's certainly a good deal of commonplace among them. But what will you have? You can't be always getting something new. That he'll turn out anything great, I don't believe, but you may safely praise him. He is well read, a remarkable Oriental scholar, and has a good judgment. It was he who wrote that nice review of the Reflections on Domestic Life. We must be lenient towards the young man. But he is a complete hack, objected another of the gentlemen. Nothing worse in poetry than mediocrity, and he certainly does not go beyond this. Poor fellow, observed a third, and his auntie's so happy about him. It was she, Mr. Editor, who got together so many subscribers for your last translation. Ah, the good woman. Well, I have noticed the book briefly. Undoubted talent, a welcome offering, a flower in the garden of poetry, prettily bought out, and so on. But this other book, I suppose, the author expects me to purchase it. I hear it is praised. He has a genius, certainly. Don't you think so? Yes, all the world declares as much, replied the poet. But it has turned out rather wildly. The punctuation of the book, in particular, is very eccentric. It will be good for him if we pull him to pieces and anger him a little. Otherwise he will get too good an opinion of himself. But that would be unfair, objected the fourth. Let us not carp little faults, but rejoice over the real and abundant good that we find here. He surpasses all the rest. Not so. If he is a true genius, he can bear the sharp voice of censure. There are people enough to praise him. Don't let us quite turn his head. Decided talent, wrote editor, with the unusual carelessness that he can write incorrect verses. Yes, may be seen in page 25. Where there are two false quantities, we recommend him to study the ancients, etc. I went away, continued the moon, and looked through the windows in the aunt's house. There sat the bepraised poet, the tame one. All the guests paid homage to him, and he was happy. I sought the other poet out, the wild one. Him also I found in a great assembly at the patrons, where the tame poet's book was being discussed. I shall read yours also, said Messianus. But to speak honestly, you know I never hide my opinion from you. I don't expect much from it, for you are too wild, too fantastic. But it must be allowed that, as a man, you are highly respectable. A young girl sat in the corner, and she read in a book these words, "In the dust lies genius and glory, but every day talent will pay. It's only the old story, but the piece is repeated each day." The 13th evening. The moon said, "Beside the woodland path, there are 2 farmhouses. The doors are low and some of the windows are placed quite high, and others close to the ground, and white-thorned barberry bushes grow around them. The roof of each house is overgrown with moss and with yellow flowers and house leek. Cabbage and potatoes are the only plants cultivated in the gardens, but out of the hedge there a great willow tree lies, and under the willow tree sat a little girl, and she sat with her eyes fixed upon the old oak tree between the 2 huts. It was an old withered stem, indeed. I remember it. It had been sawn off at the top, and a stork had built its nest upon it, and he stood in this nest clapping with his beak. A little boy came and stood by the girl's side. They were brother and sister. "What are you looking at?" they asked. "I'm watching the stork," she replied. "Our neighbours told me that he would bring us a little brother or sister today. Let us watch to see it come." "The stork brings no such things," the boy declared. "You may be sure of that." Our neighbour told me the same thing, but she laughed when she said it, and so I asked her if she could say, "On my honour," and she could not. And I know by that the story about the stork is not true, and that they only tell it to us children for fun. "But where do babies come from then?" asked the girl. "Why, an angel from heaven brings them under his cloak, but no man can see him, and that's why we never know when he brings them." At that moment there was a rustling in the branches of the willow tree, and the children folded their hands and looked at one another. It was certainly the angel coming with a baby. They took each other's hand, and at that moment the door of one of the houses opened, and the neighbour appeared. "Come in, you 2, she said. "See what the stork has brought. It is a little brother." And the children nodded gravely at one another, for they had felt quite sure already that the baby was come. The 14th evening. I was gliding over Lundberg Heath. The moon said, "A lonely hut stood by the wayside. A few scanty bushes grew near it, and a nightingale who had lost his way sang sweetly. He died in the corners of the night. It was his farewell song that I heard. The morning dawn came glimmering red. I saw a caravan of emigrant peasant families who were bound at Hamburg, there to take ship for America, where fancied prosperity would bloom for them. The mother carries their little children at their backs, and the elder ones tottered by their sides, and a poor starved horse tugged at a cart that bore their scanty effects. The cold wind whistled, and therefore the little girl nestled closer to her mother, who, looking up at my decreasing dice, thought of the bitter want to go home, and spoke of the heavy taxes they had not been able to raise. The whole caravan thought of the same thing. Therefore, the rising dawn seemed to them a message from the sun, of fortune that was to gleam brightly upon them. They heard the dying nightingale sing. It was no false prophet, but a harbinger of fortune. The wind whistled. Therefore, they did not understand that the nightingale sung. Far away over the sea, thou hast paid the long passage with all that was thine, and poor and helpless shalt thou enter Canaan. Thou must sell thyself, thy wife, and thy children, but your grief shall not last long. Behind the broad fragrant leaves lurks the goddess of death, and her welcome kiss shall breathe fever into thy blood. Far away, over the heaving billows, and the
Mm. Mm. Mm.